Chapter 591. The lion beast turned its wrist, and the holy sword of blood was instantly raised, easily blocking the treasure chest monster's attack. The high-intensity adventure of the past 2 days had indeed trained its reflexes, not to mention other things. A sneak attack of this level would not be able to hurt it at all. The lion beast exerted more force and sliced off half of the treasure chest monster's head, instantly killing it. Even among treasure chests, there were differences in strength. This treasure chest monster was obviously not as powerful as the clown from before. After killing it, the lion beast looked at the treasure chest with slight disappointment and then turned to the treasure chest on the right. The moment the treasure chest was opened, a ghost-like shriek was suddenly heard. Ah! The lion beast suddenly took 2 steps back, its ears trembling violently, and its hand holding the sword lost its strength. Then, from the gap of the treasure chest, a ghost-type monster shot out like lightning. The monster's body was extremely elongated, and there were 2 deep holes on its face. When it opened its huge mouth, it revealed a blood-red color. The lion beast was shocked by the shriek, and temporarily lost its hearing. Its head was buzzing, and it could not even lift its sword. It could only watch as the monster charged at it. Remember the URL. VIP Kanshu. VIP. But in the next second, a long sword flew over. The holy aura covered the sword and pierced through the ghost-type monster. The ghost-type monster, which was not supposed to have a physical body, let out a painful howl. With this buffer, the lion beast suddenly widened its eyes. Its fingers that were holding the sword burst with strength, and it once again held the sword in its hand tightly. Then, there was a flash of blood and the monster was cut in half. However, the one thing that the ghost-type monster was not afraid of was pure physical attacks. After it was cut in half, its upper body rushed up while its lower body escaped downwards. In the blink of an eye, it was stuck to the ceiling and the floor. Like 2 black shadows, it circled behind the lion beast, and in the next moment, it was shot at the lion beast's back from above and below at a nearly right angle. However, the lion beast's left arm grabbed backward and a lion-like energy wave was suddenly released, blowing the 2 black shadows into pieces. Phew! After confirming that the ghost-type monster had been dealt with, the lion beast heaved a sigh of relief, a chill running down his spine. If the Delu beast hadn't acted in time, it would have been bitten by that spirit monster. There are dangers lurking in the underground city. We can't let our guard down. After some self-reflection, the lion cautiously opened the lid of the second treasure chest. What surprised it was that there was a treasure hidden in the treasure chest of this monster that also came out of the treasure chest. A rock. He took out the treasure from the chest and handed it to Dake. Dake put on a pair of gloves and took it for a closer look. This stone was cold to the touch and looked very ordinary. Only one side of it had a crescent-shaped indentation. If it wasn't a coincidence that the stone was shaped like this, then it should have something to do with the moon. Dake gathered magic power on his fingertips and slowly sensed it. Then, he indeed sensed a trace of moon power. Good stuff. The moon was a perfect match for bliss. If this stone was related to the moon, then its value would naturally increase by 1 level. Dake immediately opened Eye of Truth to check it out. He immediately discovered that the value of this moonstone was even higher than the cat grass. It was 1 level higher than the crescent moon pendant from before. This was an unexpected surprise. He didn't continue to study it. Instead, he placed the moonstone in a bag and rested in the hidden room to replenish his stamina. In the underground city, if the safe zone at the entrance was said to be the safest, then the hidden rooms that had been cleaned up were the second safest. Most adventurers would choose to rest when they encountered such an opportunity. They would only set off after recovering their stamina. Half an hour later, Dake continued with his treasure hunt and pathfinding. Probably because he had already found too many treasure chests in the 10th level, he didn't find any new treasure chests until the staircase to the 11th level appeared in front of him. But contentment was bliss. Using the moonstone as the end of this underground city adventure was not bad. Dake walked down the staircase and quickly arrived at the safe zone at the entrance of the 11th level. He arrived at the safe zone at 2 p.m., which was the time when adventurers were active in the underground city. Therefore, there was almost no one in the safe zone. As for the mana marker on this level, it was a statue of a female swordsman. The statue was tall, and her long hair was tied into a ponytail. She was only wearing thin skin, revealing a large part of her skin. The sword in her hand was raised high as if it would slash down at the next moment. Dake collected the mana and sat at the side. Today's adventure ended here. He wasn't prepared to continue exploring the 11th level. From the 11th level onwards, the underground city wasn't a simple maze structure. Walking out of the safe zone was like entering a small world with various themes. The dangers of nature would follow one after another. Dake wasn't prepared to accept the baptism of nature's dangers. After he rested for a while, people gradually arrived at the safe zone of the 11th level. But the number of third-year and second-year adventurers was surprisingly small. But thinking about it, those guides would probably only bring the second-year students from the first level to the 10th level. If they were fast, they would have probably finished their mission and left yesterday. Those who were slower wouldn't have come to the 11th level. As for those who had accepted the guide mission, they had probably gone deeper into the forest a long time ago. The second-year students who were lucky enough to follow them would probably have a lot of novel experiences. Dake waited patiently. Finally, at about 4 p.m., Lydia Emerson arrived. Senior Sister Lydia had obviously gone to a deeper level. She only used door key 1/1 to teleport here now. Once her feet touched the ground, she immediately looked around and quickly found Dark, who was nearby. However, Dake had already seen her. He stood up and said, "Good afternoon, Senior." "Good afternoon, Dimming." Lydia flipped her shoulder-length hair and smiled. "Looks like I've kept you waiting." Dake smiled and said, "I just arrived." "Senior, do you have anything else to do?" "Nope." Lydia shook her head and said, "If you don't have anything, then let's go back to the first level." "No problem." Dake removed the little fiend beast from his shoulder and said, "But I have to put these little cuties back into the card first." "That's true." Senior Lydia slowly walked over with sweat on her face. Dake took out his magic card and put the Diru beast, the lion beast, the little fiend beast, and the scabbard into the card one by one. Then, he tried to carry the big and small bags. "Let me help you carry some." Lydia didn't wait for Dake to refuse and helped him carry a few bags. Then, she couldn't help but glance at the holy sword of blood on Dake's back and asked, "Is that also a spoil of war?" Dake said casually, "Yes, I got it last night." "Okay." Lydia seemed to understand. The two didn't talk much in the safe zone of the 10th level. After picking up the big and small bags, they came to the side of the female swordsman statue. Lydia took out the door key 1 and shook it in front of Dake. She asked, "You know how to enter, right?" Dake smiled and said, "Yes." So, Lydia focused and infused mana into the door key 1. After a while, a ripple appeared on the tip of the key. Then, the ripple grew bigger and bigger until it gradually expanded into a magic ring. Lydia took a step back and said with a smile, "You go first." Dake didn't refuse. He raised his hand and reached into the ring. After sensing the huge suction force coming from the ring, he relaxed a little, and his whole body was pulled in by the suction force. In the next moment, his vision changed and he was already on the first level of the dungeon. Looking at the familiar mermaid statue in front of him, Dake took 2 steps back. Then, the magic ring suddenly lit up. Light poured out from the other end and illuminated his surroundings. In the next instant, Lydia Emerson teleported over. "I'm finally back." Lydia took a deep breath and raised the door key 1. She gently tapped on the magic ring and the remaining mana in the ring was absorbed back into the key. Dake's pupils shrank and remembered it. Lydia saw that he stopped there and quickly said, "Let's go. This is the peak time for returning. If we're not careful, there will be a crowd." Dake asked, "A crowd?" Lydia explained, "It means that if there are 2 teleportation rings nearby, people who come out will bump into each other with bruises all over their heads. And if there are too many people, there won't be enough space around the magic marker, causing it to be too crowded. Anyway, let's get out of here first." Dake nodded and quickly walked forward. Then, he saw several teleportation rings appear around the magic marker. He stopped for a moment and took out the magician's secretary from his card bag. He summoned it and threw it out. The magician's secretary flipped through the pages in the air and continued to cast normal summoning. Little Fiend, Meow Meow, Horned Hawkman, and Demon Fox were summoned one after another. Doc distributed the big and small bags to them, and he immediately felt relieved. He took the bag back from Senior Lydia's hands and thanked her. "It's nothing," Lydia said curiously. "Are you going to the mission hall or to Traveler's Street to get rid of your loot?" "Let's go to the mission hall first," Dake said after thinking for a moment. Lydia smiled and said, "I'm going to hand in a mission too." "Let's go together." The weather on Sunday afternoon was quite clear. There were a few white clouds floating in the sky, and the sunlight that shone through the gaps was much warmer than the previous days. Maybe it was because they hadn't seen the sun for a long time, so even the sun had become delicate and beautiful. Dake followed Lydia into the castle and went to the mission hall to hand in a mission. It was the busiest time in the mission hall, and almost every window was full of people. Dake chose the window that he was most familiar with, No, and waited in line with Lydia. Lydia was a very talkative person. Her social skills were maxed out, and she was very observant. She could chat about almost anything. As a third-year student of the Magician Institute, she was classmates with Katrina. After chatting for a while, Dake changed the topic to Katrina. Katrina and Brittany must have handed in their missions early. They weren't in the mission hall. To Dake's surprise, Lydia didn't seem to know that Katrina was a member of the Magical Animal Society until they started chatting. She even said in surprise, "Your society is on the clock tower? When are you going to invite me for a cup of tea?" It seemed that not everyone knew that the light on the 10th floor of the clock tower belonged to a certain society. Lydia's surprise wasn't fake. She didn't seem to think that there was a society there at all. Katrina was even more low-key in class than Dake expected. After chatting for half an hour, it was finally their turn. Dake took out the materials he needed to hand in his missions, and a professional came to appraise, count, and collect them. He completed a lot of missions, and there were only 2 left to hand in. The mission, Safety First, could only be completed after he completed the dungeon storage box. He took out his school card, placed it on a special device, and handed in the advancement door completion request. The mission was quickly confirmed. Miss Bridges at window looked at him in surprise. She handed him a number plate and said, "Please go to the seat over there and wait for a moment. The mission rewards other than credits and general points will be delivered in a while." Doc nodded and led the magic elves to a bench on the side and sat down. Not long after, when Lydia also completed the mission, the student union's officer delivered the mission reward to her. Dake looked at the reward and saw the box containing the key 1/1. His face lit up. He then turned around and asked, "Senior, is there a place in Traveler's Street that sells the key to the first level of the dungeon?" Lydia thought for a moment and said, "The key is a rare resource. Apart from missions, it can only be obtained in the dungeon. The first level's key is only available in the first 10 levels, so there's always more demand than supply. If you're lucky, there might be a student who sells it." Dake was surprised. "There's no such shop?" Lydia shrugged and said regretfully, "No." Dake thought for a while and suddenly changed the topic. "If there's a shop that provides a service and only charges a small service fee, will there be any business?" Lydia was surprised by his sudden change in thinking, but she said after a while, there were similar shops, but they all closed down. Dake was speechless. Lydia smiled. "There's a lot of reasons for this. On one hand, the cheap materials don't make much profit, and it's troublesome to identify and organize them. The students also find it troublesome, so most of them sell to the shop directly. On the other hand, the expensive materials. We have the random refining method, so even if you get an expensive material that you don't need, most people would rather throw it into the random refining process and try their luck. Even if you don't need it now, it doesn't mean you won't need it in the future. So most of the students are like Squirrel, piling up valuable materials and taking them when they need them, or bartering with others. As for the stalls, apart from those who are in urgent need of credits, they're basically selling some self-made products, such as semi-finished magic cards. These products with additional technology can be sold at a higher price. And many of them are products of practice. I see. Dake seemed to understand. So what they need is a trading platform? Lydia frowned and said, "You could say that, but the mission hall has already taken on this role to a certain extent. And there's also the issue of trust. I think the students would be more willing to leave their expensive items to the college for safekeeping than to the merchants on Traveler Street." Dake nodded. That's true. This was indeed troublesome, and it was a thankless task. It was better to keep his shop for his own use. After leaving the mission hall, Dake invited Lydia to have dinner together. But she declined with the excuse that she had something to do tonight. Dake didn't force her to stay and parted ways with her at the entrance of the hall. Then he waved his hand and led the magic elves to the tower of the aristocrat house. He had gained too much from his adventure in the dungeon these few days. Even if he didn't hand in the mission, he still needed to spend a lot of time organizing them. At night, he still needed to go to Traveler Street, so he couldn't rest for the time being. There wasn't much interaction along the way, so Dake quickly arrived at the tower of the aristocrat house. He crossed the bridge and entered the common room. As soon as he opened the door, he heard the clamor of the crowd. The second-year students were without a doubt the biggest source of noise. They were excitedly discussing their adventures in the dungeon. Some of them even talked about it from early morning until now. Some of them even took out some rare items to show off. In short, it was very lively. Dake sometimes felt that he didn't fit in with the other students, but this was the effect he wanted, so he didn't mind. But just as he entered the room, someone saw him and called out excitedly, "Dake, why are you only back now? Wait, you brought a lot of things." Dake smiled shyly and said, "It's not a lot. I need to go back to my room and tidy it up. You guys chat first." Saying that, he walked straight through the corridor. The second-year students didn't call out to him. They just stared at the holy sword of blood. This sacred sword was simply too eye-catching. After Dake's voice disappeared around the corner of the stairs, a student suddenly said, "What do you guys think is up with that sword?" Then someone immediately followed up. "What else could it be? It must be a reward from a boss, right? Or did he get it from a treasure chest?" "Treasure chest," someone said enviously. "Speaking of which, have you seen what a treasure chest looks like?" Dolong and Pitten immediately raised their noses and said, "Of course, we saw it last semester." Someone else said, "Speaking of which, when you guys first entered the dungeon last semester, you guys successfully fought a boss. Damn, it's so sour. I'm going to make a cup of sour lemon juice." After reaching the third floor, the voices behind him gradually disappeared. Dake opened the door and entered room 301. The room was very quiet. The cat plants were sent to the club classroom and were taken care of by the Sabegu. Dake ordered the enchanted fairies to put down everything and started counting them one by one. Excluding the items that were used to turn in missions and the treasures from the treasure chests, this adventure in the dungeon also yielded a lot of monster materials. That was also a big part of the inventory and processing. Dake summoned Paradise and asked Magician Secretary to summon as many enchanted fairies as possible before starting to process the materials. Those that needed to be cleaned and sliced were sliced, those that needed to be ground into powder were ground into powder, and those that needed to be soaked for preservation were soaked. Anyway, he didn't expect to rely on these materials to earn academic credits. It was more convenient to store more materials, but he was afraid that they would expire and deteriorate. Anyway, this wasn't something that needed to be considered now. With the help of enough enchanted fairies, Dake's processing speed was very fast. At about 7 o'clock in the evening, he was done with all the things. There were many bottles and jars in the room. "It's finally over." Dake looked at the Dragon Fong sword, Gale dagger, Blood Sacred sword, and Emerald Sacred sword, hanging on the shelf. He felt gratified as if he was looking at a clean classroom after a thorough cleaning. He looked up at the wall clock, put on his jacket, and rushed to Traveler Street. Traveler Street was very lively on Sunday night, and there were cheering students everywhere. Dake supplemented some experimental materials according to the list and bought all the materials needed for the dungeon storage box I. Then, he went to the Ultimate Duel Club shop and learned about the shop situation from the two sisters, Eve and Erin. Eve said with a smile, "The current situation is good. The sales of the dual disc are going up, and there are many people buying card packs. However, the number of customers in the college is limited. If we want to really develop, we have to look outside. The Silver Cup opening ceremony next Friday will be the time to determine the winner." Dake nodded and said, "Is there any program arranged?" Eve said, "Miss Claire and Mr. Fernandy have communicated and scheduled a mock duel exhibition match at the opening ceremony of the Silver Cup, but they haven't decided on the candidates yet." Dake asked, "Can't it be just the two of you?" Erin curled her lips and said, "Miss Claire said that we are internal staff and can't be exposed too much. Besides, we aren't famous. It's best to find famous people to act in it." Famous people. Dake blinked. Celebrity duelists? Eve and Erin nodded at the same time. "Yes, it's best if it's an internal student of the college. Therefore, we have come up with two plans." Dake asked curiously, "Tell me about them." Eve said, "One is our loyal customer, Hero's son White Gouda. The other is Silver Dragon Lady, who once stayed at the Duke's mansion. Of course, if young master is willing to show his face. I'm also an internal staff, okay?" Dake shook his head and rejected Eve's common-sense proposal. Then he analyzed, White is indeed a good gimmick. If it's him, he can also show the customers his true passion for the game. Most importantly, he probably won't refuse this invitation. As long as he and Luo both go together. As for Senior, to be honest, I don't have much confidence in her. Erin whispered, "If you invite her, how can she refuse?" Eve immediately glared at her and said, "If it's Senior Panduola, she's definitely popular enough, but it's hard for us to find someone who's as popular as her, so this is only the second plan." Dake pondered and said, "Someone who's as popular as her, Knight Baron Noah Sharp?" Eve said, "If it's Winnie Scotty, the daughter of Frigid Winter. I remember that young master and her took alchemy classes in the same classroom." Dake couldn't help but roll his eyes inwardly. However, he had a share in this shop after all, so he said, "If it's Senior Winnie, I can also ask her. Let's do it tomorrow at noon. I need to ask Senior Panduola for her opinion first. As for White, forget it, I'll go and ask her. If both sides agree, we'll have 2 exhibition matches. Otherwise, we'll have 1. What do you think?" "Okay." Eve nodded hurriedly, secretly delighted. With young master making a move, how could it not be a piece of cake? Dake shook his head and walked out of the shop. Then, in order to find the door key 1, he wandered around Traveler Street for a long time. However, he seemed to have used up all his luck in the underground city. In the end, he didn't even see a shadow of it. If there's no other way, I'll just go and post a door key 1 mission. Summer left and autumn came. The night wind was slightly chilly. Dake carried the bag and walked up the spiral clock tower. The lights were still on in the Magical Animal Society on the 10th floor. He knocked on the door after arriving at the society, and Anna hurried over to open the door. "You're finally here." When Anna saw Dake, she immediately grabbed his hand and ran into the room. "Wait." Dake quickly closed the door and asked, "What's wrong?" Anna stopped, looked around, and said mysteriously, "Guess what we encountered in the underground city?" Dake quickly said, "Treasure chests, secret rooms, hidden spaces, level bosses?" Anna's little face fell. Luo C, who followed them out, covered her mouth and chuckled. Okay. Dake comforted them as he followed them into Katarina's reading room. There weren't many books in the reading room. They only filled half of the bookshelf. Katarina and Brittany were sitting around the tea table, carefully studying the books. On the tea table, a furry little bear was crawling slowly on its stomach. It looked like a newborn animal, but its fur was already fully grown. Its 4 legs were very short and round, and it looked very cute. Katerina and Brittany, however, stared at it with puzzled expressions. It wasn't until Ko entered the room that the two of them raised their heads and relaxed their nerves. Katerina said, "President, you're finally back." Dake frowned. "What's wrong?" Katerina pointed at the little bear on the table and said, "We might have found a magical animal in the underground city." "How can there be a magical animal in the underground city?" Dake replied subconsciously. But when his eyes fell on the little bear, he couldn't move them away. After a while he muttered, "Is this a magical animal?" The 4 members of the Magical Animal Society brought back a magical animal from the underground city. Dake sat down on the sofa. He didn't immediately observe the magical animal. Instead, he asked curiously, "Tell me, how did you find it?" Katerina and Brittany looked at each other. Deanna couldn't wait and said, I'll tell you. Then, she quickly explained what happened to the 4 of them in the underground city. 2 third-year guides and 2 second-year students. The 4 of them entered the underground city at noon on Friday and entered the first floor of the labyrinth. Deanna wanted to lead the charge, but Katerina grabbed her by the back of her neck. A magus should fight like a magus. Diana imitated Katerina's tone and spoke in a methodical manner. After that, we used our familiars to lead the way and summoned a magical elf each. Katerina and Brittany were really good at finding the way. We quickly found the stairs to the 2nd floor. After reaching the 2nd floor, the 4 of them rested for a while and continued their journey. Just like that, they arrived at the 7th floor before nightfall on Friday night. This efficiency could be said to be quite high. The 4 of them had a surprisingly good team composition. Deanna was the vanguard, Luosi was the healer, Katerina was the strategist, and Brittany was the rearguard and scout. Brittany's magical dolls could easily summon a large number of dolls to scout the way. Using a special magical card, she could even share her vision with the dolls. With the 4 of them working together, they were able to find the way quickly. The magical animals on the first 10 floors didn't pose much of a threat to them. That night, the 4 of them chatted about girls for the whole night and became closer. The next day was Saturday. As usual, they relied on their teamwork to find the way quickly and arrived at the 10th floor at noon on Saturday. From the 1st floor to the 10th floor, the 4 of them didn't encounter anything out of the ordinary. They just dealt with the magical animals step by step, found the way, and continued moving forward. As it was too early, they even rested for 2 hours in the safe zone on the 10th floor before continuing their journey. From the 10th floor to the 11th floor, it only took the 4 of them 2 hours. Especially since it was too early, after the 4 of them had a discussion, they boldly entered the inner area of the 11th floor. Of course, it wasn't the first time Katerina and Brittany explored the 10th floor and below. However, they were always the ones being led. Now that they were the ones leading the way, they weren't used to it. Moreover, the space on the 11th floor had been refreshed many times. It was already different from what they knew. The entire space was like a tropical rainforest. Not only were there towering trees and flowing rivers, but there were also insects and poisonous plants of various sizes. The magical animals had also learned to hide in the bushes and bushes. It was impossible to guard against a sudden attack. The 4 of them moved forward cautiously. Thanks to Katerina's encyclopedic knowledge, they avoided many dangers. However, in the end, they still encountered a group of magical animals and were chased away in panic. As a result, they ended up in an unknown place. Katerina and Brittany both lost their direction. Deanna and Luosi spread out their hands, completely clueless. At this time, the sky had already darkened. After some discussion, the 4 of them made a bold decision. They would sleep in the rainforest. To sleep in the wild, the first thing they needed to do was to find a safe place. However, in the buried city where magical animals were everywhere, there was basically no safe place. In the end, it was Katerina who came up with a solution. They planned to find a huge tree, then dig a hole in the tree and create a hole for themselves. In order to accommodate the 4 of them, they began to move toward the largest tree they could see nearby. After about 10 minutes, they finally found the huge tree. After cleaning up the surroundings to a certain extent, Katerina summoned a magical elf and began to dig a hole in the tree. However, After piercing through the tree's shell, the four of them were shocked to find that there was a hole in the tree. Not only was the hole spacious, but there was also an underground tunnel that led directly to the ground. The four of them were instantly excited. Just like that, we found the hidden room on the 11th floor. Anna seemed a little proud when she said this. Everyone knew that the buried city was filled with all kinds of hidden rooms. However, to truly find them, one would need both luck and strength. Faced with such a situation, even Brittany, who had always been cautious, did not say anything. Thus, the four of them entered the underground tunnel in the tree hole excitedly and cautiously. The hidden room was very big. However, not only were they not afraid, they were even more excited. This was because the size of the hidden room was usually proportional to the final harvest. In order to deal with unexpected situations, they all summoned their second-tier magical elves and gradually went deeper. In the end, relying on Anna's physical strength, they finally defeated the magical animals blocking their way and reached the end of the underground room. There, they found a treasure chest placed on a wooden stake. In the buried city, no one would be able to resist the temptation of a treasure chest. Especially after such a long time of exploration, they found a treasure chest. Anna ran over excitedly, and even Katrina could not stop her. Luo-Si quickly summoned his magical elves just in case. Then, as expected, there was no treasure in the treasure chest, there was a treasure chest hidden inside. And then? Dake listened attentively and could not help but ask. Anna curved her eyebrows and pointed at the baby bear that was crawling on the table. Dake immediately understood. "This is the treasure chest monster?" Anna smiled and said, "Yes." Dake said in surprise, "So you brought the treasure chest monster back?" "Yes." Anna said, "Aren't we the Magical Zoology Society? It's normal to have one more baby bear." "It's normal." Dake read. Then, he could not help but stare at the baby bear that was crawling on the table. The baby bear seemed to have felt his sharp gaze and dodged for a moment. Dake said cautiously, "It won't attack people?" Anna reached out and grabbed the baby bear into her arms, exposing its snow-white belly. The baby bear spread its short legs helplessly and let Anna do whatever she wanted. It did not only not attack people, it did not even have the intention to attack, okay? "I can't believe there is such a monster in the buried city." Dake could not help but press his forehead. No wonder Katrina and Brittany had been studying it. The existence of this baby bear had indeed defied common sense. For example, although elite demons and tier bosses had a higher degree of intelligence, their nature as demons would still make them uncontrollably bare their fangs at adventurers. Even the two rational monsters that Doc encountered last night also displayed extremely strong aggressiveness. No. Dake's eyes suddenly flashed as he thought of a monster. That monster's presence was too weak, so he subconsciously ignored it. But now that he recalled it, he immediately connected the dots. Before the tier boss, the Orc Sword Saint, appeared, there was clearly a rat monster that was being chased by it. Monsters in the buried city would sometimes escape, but that was to pave the way for them to make a comeback. But that mouse was different. Dake remembered the way it hid in the shadows and revealed its tail but while trembling. Now, it seemed that the mouse was the monster with the highest rationality and intelligence that he met last night. But if he equated the bear cub with the rat monster, Doc's gaze couldn't help but become more serious. He activated his chakra, gathered the air into his palm, and reached out to the baby bear. "Let me hold it." Anna happily handed the baby bear over. Dake grabbed the baby bear's armpit, lifted it up, and said casually, "So you only found this treasure chest monster in that hidden room?" "Of course not." Anna said excitedly, "We also found a lot of fruits that could be used, and they were all very sweet. There were also some shiny minerals and monster materials. They were all piled up in the corner of that room. Oh, and we also found that." Anna looked at Luo-Si. Luo-Si took out a necklace from his bag. The necklace's chain was golden, but it didn't seem to be made of gold. The pendant was made of two overlapping circular metal frames, and there was a crystal ball that could fluctuate inside. "A crystal ball necklace?" Dake asked. Luo-Si replied, "Yes. I have a feeling that it can improve the ability of astrology. Let me see. Doc retracted his gaze and concentrated for a moment. His dark green eyes turned into a resplendent golden color. But after activating Eye of Truth, he didn't look at the crystal ball necklace, but looked at the baby bear in the air. See, stare. I fell asleep in front of the computer last night, so the update is late. Today's update will be before 6 a.m. 6 a.m. for Hedgehog Cat's time is counted as one day. 223/233. Only 10 more chapters to go. Please vote. Dungeon Treasure, Magic Diamond, 20. Chicken Comb Soft Silver O-Ring of Strength Yellow Core, 12. Purple Core, 12. Powder Core, 12. Treasure Map. Orb of Perception, Insect Tree, Crescent Moon Pendant Bottled Potion Wood Carving Bronze Eyeball Flower of Dreams Dagger of Wind Blood Crystal, 6. Soul Sucker Spirit Door Key, Cat Grass, Bronze Mirror Orb of Charm Rhino Horn Gravity Boots Moonstone, Magic Brain Dropper, Clown Mask Creature Orb Silver Sphinx Dragon Tooth Sword, Trash Slime, Magic Fire, Blood Crystal Crown, Eagle Wrestling, Holy Sword of Blood. Chapter 592. Under the gaze of the Eye of Truth, a hint of panic flashed across Cub Bear's face. Dake stared at it for a while before looking at the crystal ball necklace. He had a feeling that this crystal ball necklace should be the treasure in the secret room's treasure chest. And this cub bear in his hand might have been hidden in the secret room after all the treasures were taken away. How is it? Luo Si asked. Dake closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they had turned dark green. It does feel like it can move the stars. In terms of value, it should be higher than the cat grass, but lower than the moonstone. As for the cub bear, it had the same value as the trash slime. This was actually very incredible for the monsters in the underground city. Remember this. https://m. Vipkanchu. VIP Dake had looked at the value of the monsters in the past 2 days. No matter how strong they were not valuable because they were incomplete products born in the underground city. In the eyes of the Door of Truth, the value of a monster was basically the same as the materials they dropped. But this cub bear's value was comparable to the trash slime. This probably meant that it was at least a special individual that was completely different from normal monsters. As for what was special about it, in this aspect, Dake could not have any more experience. However, he did not use any violent measures. Instead, he put the cub bear back on the table, and then he scratched its feet lightly. The next moment, the cub bear's mouth twitched violently. Dake's mouth twitched, and he scratched faster. The cub bear pursed its lips tightly, but its body twitched. It was very difficult for it to endure. So much so that its different behavior was completely exposed in the eyes of the despicable human. Deanna's eyes widened, and she wondered, why isn't it laughing? Therefore, in the next moment, Cub Bear, who realized that his desperate attempt to hold himself back was even more suspicious, immediately began to chuckle. But at this time, no one believed it anymore. Damn it! Deanna wasn't really an idiot. She immediately saw that the little bear had been pretending to be a baby. She was angry and immediately pulled Little Bear's cheeks apart. She accidentally pulled Little Bear's face off. Ah! Deanna suddenly let go of her hand. She was shocked. Katrina and Brittany hurried over as well. However, Luo Si moved back a little. Dake looked at the bear with a missing piece on its left cheek and finally remembered what kind of magical creature it was. On the other side, Katrina had already flipped the bear over so that its left face was facing up, revealing the tissue inside. It was a pink gelatinous substance. As expected, Dake's eyes were bright, but his heart was gradually coming to a decision. In the dungeon, there was a type of magical creature called the parasitic spirit. It was a bug and spirit-type insect. They were very large in size compared to other insects. They didn't have any burrs, and their whole body was pink and smooth. They only had 3 pairs of flat and round legs that were sticky. If these magical creatures were transformed into magical elves, they would be a special type with 0 attack and 0 defense. They didn't have any attack or defense abilities, and any magical creature could easily pierce through their soft pink skin. However, such a useless parasitic spirit had an extremely powerful and strange sure-kill skill. Every parasitic spirit that was in perfect condition could use this sure-kill skill to parasitize a magical creature's corpse and repair it to the state it was in before it died. Then, they would replace it. Dake didn't know why this parasitic spirit didn't choose a powerful magical creature to parasitize, but instead chose this cute and useless cub bear. Could it have predicted that Anna wouldn't be able to resist cub bear in advance? Otherwise, with the situation at that time, if someone else opened the chest, cub bear would have been decapitated and completely exposed. Dake didn't understand, but he didn't think it was that important. "Looks like it's a parasitic spirit," Katrina suddenly said, coinciding with Dake's judgment. Anna calmed down and quickly asked, "What's a parasitic spirit?" Katerina patiently explained the situation to Natsuya. While she was explaining, she picked up the piece of cub bear's cheek that was torn off and pressed it back on cub bear's left cheek. After a while, the crack on cub bear's skin was slowly repaired, and it was impossible to tell that it was torn off. Cub bear blinked its big black eyes, as if it was trying to pretend that nothing had happened. But everything could no longer be reversed. Since it was confirmed that cub bear was a parasitic spirit, it had completely lost the cub treatment. Even Anna was fuming, let alone the others. Brittany originally had a good impression of cub bear, which looked like a doll, but when she realized that its core was actually a worm, she instantly fell in love with it. Dake shook his head and continued, "The parasitic spirit's ultimate skill isn't that easy to use. Every time they parasitize, they have to wait until the outer shell completely dies before they can parasitize a second time. This cub bear's outer shell shouldn't be as weak as it looks. Let's do an experiment first, Anna." "Oh," Anna replied. Dake then said, "Press its hand down." Before he even finished, cub bear started to panic. Dake watched as cub bear flipped over and stood up, and then Anna grabbed cub bear's neck and lifted it up. Even though cub bear's two short legs looked fast, it was nothing if it couldn't touch the ground. Pfft. Luosi couldn't help but laugh out loud. She quickly turned her face away, and her cheeks flushed red. However, cub bear's appearance was indeed cute and funny. After it stopped pretending to be a newborn cub that couldn't even walk and could only crawl, cub bear showed great speed and strength. However, in front of Anna, this strength was just icing on the cake. It was useless. This was probably why cub bear pretended to be a coward after Anna opened the treasure chest. That treasure chest might even be cub bear's bed. Imagine lying in bed in the middle of the night when someone suddenly opened the curtains and woke you up to see a huge shadow pouncing on you. It was already good enough that you didn't pee your pants on the spot. Cub bear was able to give up on attacking in that state and chose to play the role of a cub to survive. It could be seen that cub bear's intelligence was extraordinary. Dake couldn't help but laugh. Although he felt that it was impossible, he still asked, "Can you speak?" "Woo." Cub bear quickly shook its head. It didn't seem like it would rather die than submit. Dake nodded and said, "Seems like you can understand human language. When did you learn to think?" Cub bear was stunned for a moment, then its entire body froze. Obviously, cub bear didn't expect the human to be so direct. Not only cub bear, but Katrina and the others also realized this and looked at cub bear strangely. As everyone knew, the biggest difference between simulated life and real life was whether a simulated life had the ability to think for itself. The most obvious difference between Dake Diming's magical elf and other magical elves was that magical elves had the ability to think for themselves. In this aspect, Dake Dimeng was the authority. Therefore, when Dake said this, Katrina and the others subconsciously believed this unbelievable thing. However, Dake had completely wiped the smile off his face and said to Cub Bear in a very cold tone, "You'd better think carefully if you want to answer if you don't want to die again. You have to know that this isn't the dungeon." The last sentence seemed to be the last straw that overwhelmed the parasite. Cub Bear hurriedly waved its arms and whimpered. Dake supported his chin and guessed, "I think you want a pen and paper?" Cub Bear immediately nodded and looked as if it was going to break its neck. Dake signaled to Anna with his eyes. Anna understood and let go of the back of Cub Bear's neck. Then, Luo Si immediately took a pen and paper from the desk behind. Cub Bear sat down with its legs apart expressionlessly and moved the paper between its two short legs. Then, it grabbed the pen and started writing on the paper. It seemed like it hadn't written for a long time, or its paws weren't good at it. At first, the words it wrote were crooked, and it was impossible to tell what it was writing. However, after writing about a line, it gradually became familiar with it and crossed out the line with a horizontal stroke. Then, it started writing again. Frowny face. My name is Shirley Augustine. You can call me Shirley. Let's call it Cub Bear, Deanna interrupted. Cub Bear, Dake quickly said. Okay, continue. Shirley Augustine, right? I heard a long time ago that the bosses of the dungeons are people or other creatures that have left important records in history. Which type do you belong to? Cub Bear looked up at him and seemed surprised that he knew so much. However, Cub Bear still wrote on the paper, human. Not only was it once a human, but it should have been a human in the past few hundred years. Ever since the conflict between the humans and the demons intensified and the unstoppable war began, the language had never been changed. Shirley Augustine's words were obviously contemporary. This meant that if it could speak, it should be the current official language. Dake thought for a moment and said, I have 3 questions that need answers. First, what was your identity when you were alive? Second, how did you regain your memory and the ability to think after you woke up in the dungeon? Third, how did you end up like this? Little Bear Cub glanced at him again, then bent down and started scribbling. However, Dake continued in a calm tone, I hope you are not lying. I have met more than one monster in the dungeon that was similar to you. They will tell me if you are telling the truth. Cub Bear's pen paused for a moment and then started writing again. Dake leaned back on the sofa and waited patiently. However, after hearing his words, the other members of the club could not wait any longer. Katrina was curious about this and immediately asked, What's going on? Why do I feel like I don't understand? Dake organized his words and chose a way to explain it. Actually, I met an intelligent monster last night. They are different from normal monsters. They can learn and think. Judging from this parasite's body, they should still have their memories. Monsters have memories. Katrina quickly changed her train of thought and hesitated. When did they have memories? Dake said, there are 3 types of monsters in the dungeon. Normal, elite, and boss. I don't know if there are any special individuals among the normal and elite monsters, but the boss of each level should be the true projection of a person or other creature that existed in history. However, they should only be a kind of virtual shell that was copied and shouldn't have memories. It is very likely that something unknown is happening in the dungeon. Katrina opened her mouth and could not close it for a long time. Dake's words were not difficult to understand, but they were so hard to believe that it was hard to digest. However, Cub Bear perked up its ears to eavesdrop and immediately wrote a few words on another line. Then, it looked up and knocked on the paper with the tip of its pen. Dake looked down and saw what was written on the paper. Are there really other monsters that have awakened? You are not lying to me? Dake found it funny after reading it. What's the point of lying to you? Why don't you reflect on your current situation? Little Bear Cub immediately lowered his head and started writing obediently. 10 minutes later, it had written a full page on the paper. Dake pulled out the paper and read it carefully. Shirley Augustine was the first to answer the question of her identity. As expected, she used to have a noble identity. If she did not lie to elevate her status, she was not only a noble princess in the past, but she was also born with a huge amount of magic power. She was born with a powerful spell called City of Ice and Snow. It was said that this spell was called Forbidden Spell. Once successfully cast, it could turn an entire city into a frozen hell. Normal magicians would not be able to learn Forbidden Spell of this scale in their lifetime. However, there were always people who were born to stand at the top. Shirley Augustine was obviously such a person. She was originally called Ice Princess. The kingdom she was in was located in the north, and an ice tower was specially built for her. This was actually a very famous event in history. However, in later generations, Many people said that the ice tower was actually used to imprison the ice princess, so that she could not leave and would forever protect the kingdom. When Dake heard the name Shirley Augustine, he did not immediately think of it. But now, after reading the description, he finally remembered. Katrina, who had already come to his side to check, was surprised. "It's actually Shirley, the Ice Princess. I remember that she was assassinated in a war. There was a demon who controlled her mind, who controlled her bodyguard. Woo!" After hearing this, Shirley immediately wrote a sentence on the next piece of paper. Was Sydney really controlled by the demons? Katrina said, "I can only say that this is what was recorded in the history books." The little bear was obviously relieved and muttered, "Woo." Although Dake did not understand bear language, he could imagine that it must be saying things like, "I knew it wasn't her, she wouldn't betray me," and so on. Hundreds of years later, the Ice Kingdom that occupied the north was submerged in an avalanche, but the last princess of the kingdom woke up in the underground city. Was all of this lucky, or sad? Shirley Augustine was first awakened as a boss of a tier. She guarded the 32nd floor, which was once filled with snowflakes and glaciers that never melted. But after the boss, the Ice Princess, was successfully subdued, the 32nd floor also entered the respawn sequence of the underground city. But in the underground city, death was not the end. Before Shirley Augustine was subdued, she only received a small part of her memory. She did not even know who she was, only her name. But after many years after the death of the boss, the Ice Princess, she woke up again, but she was no longer a boss, but an elite monster. For her, this could be said to be her second resurrection. Even though Kieran had lost his human form, becoming a parasite wasn't a bad thing either. At the very least, it could find its favorite corpse to live in and obtain a lifespan that was longer than that of a human, if it wasn't killed. And unlike a boss, who was trapped in a boss room and could not go out, an elite monster could occasionally be the guardian of a hidden room or a treasure chest, but in fact, it could move freely. But the dangers outside were completely unknown, and Shirley Augustine was not the type to be easily moved. She had a lot of experience in how to spend time alone in a lonely room. So after her resurrection, she first relied on the ghost characteristics to find Zhongyi's shell, and then with the hidden space under the tree hole as the center, she lived a leisurely monster life. During this period, she experienced several changes of the world, but she only changed the appearance of a few tree holes. To her, it was like changing the decoration of the door, but it gave her a taste of life. She did not know how her memory was restored, and she was not clear about how she gained the ability to think. In short, since she woke up as a boss, she could often see some fragments of memory. This situation did not change until the parasite was resurrected as an elite monster. After a long time, she gradually recovered more than half of her memory. Although that was the case, in fact, she could not remember many details of life very well. And the more she understood the cause and effect, the more she knew that she was not the original Shirley. Even if she had the ability to think and recover her memory, she was still a historical projection created by the underground city, a virtual shell. A character with a high degree of rationality could clearly separate themselves from the original body. But if a character lacked rationality, they might gradually confuse themselves with the original body. Shirley Augustine was a born magician. Even if she woke up as a boss and was resurrected as a parasite, she did not forget the forbidden spell that she was born with, Ice City Seal. But in her current state, she did not have enough magic power to cast Ice City Seal. Apart from Ice City Seal, she only had the ability of the corpse bear that she was a parasite on. Although the little bear was a relatively weak existence even among the magical creatures on the 11th floor, who asked it to look so similar to the teddy bear plushie that Shirley put beside her bed when she was a princess. Shirley Augustine, it was almost love at first sight. For the little girl who was only 13 years old when she was assassinated, her natural rationality could not change the fact that she was only 13 years old. If it were Anna, she would probably make the same choice. After all, the little bear is so cute. Anna suddenly hugged the little bear. She did not care about the fact that Shirley's core was a worm anymore. But Dake was a psychologically mature adult. Of course, he would not completely believe what the little bear said. And the little bear seemed to have said a lot from the beginning to the end, but in fact, it was all nonsense that could be guessed. On one hand, it revealed that it still had the talent to use iCity Seal to show its value. On the other hand, it said that it lacked the magic power to use iCity Seal to show that it was harmless. Even the reason why it chose the little bear as a parasite was that it was naive, cute, and nostalgic. In front of a group of girls, it was no doubt a very good reason. But in the end, it did not explain how it recovered its memory and how it had the ability to think. It used the excuse that it did not know. But did it really not know? Only it knew the answer to that question. Dake thought carefully and decided to wait until the summoning class in the morning to tell Professor Shi Erfu about the changes that were happening in the underground city. In any case, the existence of this little bear was a natural proof. There was indeed an unknown change happening in the underground city. Many magical creatures were gradually regaining their rationality and transforming into complete life forms. And the change that caused all this was very likely to be hidden in the depths of the underground city. Dake, can I bring baby bear back to the dormitory? Anna hugged the little bear tightly and looked at Dake eagerly. Dake glanced at the little bear that was also staring at him with its big round eyes and smiled. Of course not. I remembered that I had to get the second vaccine at 8 o'clock in the morning, so I didn't stay up late. Also, my cousin is very busy with his engagement today, so I don't know if I can update before midnight. Anyway, I'll get up early and go to sleep after updating. My life is more important. 224 of 233. Only 9 chapters left. Please vote. Chapter 593. No matter what template this little bear was based on, it was now a magical creature and an uncontrollable factor. Dake was already being very generous by not locking it in a cage at this time. It was even more impossible for him to let Anna take it away as a bolster. The best way now was naturally to leave it in the club classroom and let the magic elves watch over it. Fortunately, there were still many spare rooms in the club classroom. Dake let the little bear choose one for itself and called the dream demon over. He solemnly entrusted the task of watching over the little bear to her. Little demon. The little dream demon replied energetically, looking as if she was ready to complete the task at all costs. Thus, Dake secretly gave the lion a look, and the latter slowly nodded. It was already very late that night, so Dake did not stay in the club classroom for too long. He finally observed the 3 ghost butterflies in the bonsai for a while and let the magic elves return to the dormitory to bring the catgrass and foxgrass. Finally, under the reluctant gaze of the subgu beast, he made the little anti-bird go berserk from the cradle. Only then did he leave the club classroom. Everyone agreed to come back to the club classroom tomorrow afternoon after school to continue the research, and then return to their dormitories. The first website was https://m. Vipkanshu. VIP. The little anti-bird suddenly woke up on the way back to the dormitory. It was so noisy that it attracted a lot of attention in the common room. It seemed that its courage was not as big as imagined. The completely unfamiliar environment made it feel afraid, and it kept clinging to Dake's chest. It was not until they entered the relatively narrow dormitory that the little anti-bird slowly became active. When Dake carried it into the bathtub to take a bath, it completely recovered its vitality. After making a ruckus in the bathroom for a long time, Dake carried the soaked chicken out and carefully wiped it dry with a dry towel. Not long after, Aurora came to the door with supper. Dake originally thought that since it was so late, Aurora would not come. He did not expect that not only did she come, but she also brought a big meal, a whole snow ginseng stewed chicken. Aurora put the plate on the table and opened the lid. The rich aroma of the snow ginseng stewed chicken instantly burst out. Goo goo. Little anti-bird suddenly smelled the fragrance and jumped onto the table with a flap of its wings. It tilted its head and looked at the plate. Then, in the next second, he was so scared that he fled into his bed and shivered under the blankets. Poochie. Dake puffed up his cheeks and laughed out loud. He hurriedly picked it up and patted its back. The other magic guiding fairies came to the table, took out small bowls filled with chicken soup, and sipped it. Aurora looked curiously at the small Ubisoft bird and began to fill the Dake's soup bowl with sliced ginseng and chicken. Finally, she placed a large drumstick into it. She had insisted on coming over tonight to nourish Dake's body. "You must be tired after spending 2 nights in the dungeon, right?" she thought. Dake Dimeng drank a big bowl of snow ginseng chicken soup and only managed to fall asleep at 2 in the morning. But Shirley Augustine, who was locked up in the Magical Zoology Society, didn't sleep until 2 in the morning. She leaned against the soft pillow and flipped through the books that she hadn't read for a long time. Her heart was very nervous. It wasn't that Shirley Augustine didn't like soft pillows and a comfortable room. It could even be said that she had been looking forward to such a life every night in the dungeon, but it wasn't realized in such a way. From Dake and the others, Shirley Augustine already knew that this was the famous Shang Malian Academy. But other than that, she didn't know anything else. What was the Shang Malian Academy like? Were the professors kind or evil? Would they kill her just because she was a monster? She heard that these people who studied magic guiding technology were ruthless and liked to cut up monsters for research. Shirley Augustine didn't want to be soaked in formalin at all. The 4 girls at the beginning weren't scary at all. Why was the boy who appeared later so scary? She carefully pulled the blanket up a little and put the book that was almost as big as her on the bed. Finally, she shrunk under the blanket. She didn't know what her fate would be in the future, but she knew that she was powerless to change it. This feeling was very uncomfortable. It was just like when she was still a princess and was locked up in the ice tower. Powerless to change, isolated and helpless. Unless she had the courage to destroy everything. There was one thing that Shirley had lied about. The night was deep. The first adventure of the second-year students in the dungeon had completely ended. Most of them had more or less gained something. And the number of people who triggered the dungeon escape device was 0. This was good news for many people. Professor Cheong-si was satisfied. Professor Nini was smiling like a flower. Sister Ka-lien was also relaxed and happy. A world where no one was hurt was completed. But the excitement of successfully crossing this threshold still made many people unable to sleep. It was rare that someone was late for the summoning class on Monday morning. Professor Shi Erfu expressionlessly deducted 5 marks for each person who was late. Then, he asked them to sit down and continued with the class. Under Professor Shi Erfu's control, the little magisters completely calmed down and quickly resumed the learning atmosphere. Since the Silver Cup was about to start, Professor Shi Erfu also focused on actual combat when teaching summoning. The students who didn't want to embarrass themselves at the Silver Cup all listened very carefully. After the class, Dake immediately went to find Professor Shi Erfu. Professor Shi Erfu walked in front with the documents in his arms. Dake quickly followed and said in a low voice, "Professor, can I talk to you in private?" Professor Shi Erfu couldn't help but ask in surprise, "Is there something you can't say now?" Dake nodded and said, "Can you come directly to my Magical Animal Society?" "Got it." Professor Shi Erfu quickly nodded and reached out his slender hand. Dake reached out and grabbed it. He felt a bit cold. In the next second, he completely turned into the wind along with Professor Shi Erfu. When his vision cleared, Dake found himself on the spiral clock tower and at the entrance of the Society's classroom. He subconsciously stepped on the ground twice before turning around and saying, "Welcome to the Magical Animal Society." Professor Shi Erfu smiled and said, "If you have something to say, just say it. There's still a class after this." Dake smiled and opened the door. "It's like this. Didn't Anna and Luo Si go to the dungeon 2 days ago?" Professor Shi Erfu said as he walked. "What happened?" Dake said, "They brought back a magical creature." Dake turned around and found that Professor Shi Erfu had stopped walking. Then, Professor Shi Erfu said, "Wait, can you say that again?" Dake said helplessly, "They brought back a magical creature. It's now in the Society's classroom." Professor Shi Erfu took a deep breath and put on a serious face again. "Take me to see it." "Okay." Dake turned around and went straight to the study room. He came to the Society's classroom in the morning. Other than bringing back his aunt's bird, he mainly wanted to see if the bear cub was obedient. When he arrived, he found that the bear cub had woken up early and went into Katerina's study room. He glanced at the books on the table and knew that the bear cub was trying to understand the outside world through the books. He didn't stop it and just told it to stay put. "It's here." Dake came to the study room, and knocked twice before pushing the door open and entering. Professor Shi Erfu walked in quickly. Her eyes immediately fell on the bear cub that was curled up on the sofa. She frowned and said, "It's really a magical creature?" The bear cub put down the book and turned its head stiffly to look at the person who should be the academy's professor. It thought that with the temperament of a young boy and girl, it would have some time to think. It didn't expect that there would be someone here who didn't follow the rules at all. Dake Dimeng directly invited the academy's professor over. Although Professor Shi Erfu was a half-elf, her ears were long and pointy like those of pure-blooded elves. Her light golden hair was ethereal. Other than being more broad-minded than pure-blooded elves, there was almost no difference. At least in Shirley Augustine's time, the elves were a race with a good reputation. Shirley's initial impression of Professor Shi Erfu wasn't bad, but she felt that her expression was a bit too serious. But at least she didn't look like a butcher with a fierce face. One had to know that she had woken up a few times last night because she was scared awake by a butcher with a machete. And now Mr. Butcher was here again. "Xiong Bao, come over and meet Professor Shi Erfu," Dake said calmly as he walked over. "Woo, woo, woo." The bear cub grabbed a writing board from the sofa and wrote a line of words. "It's not Xiong Bao. It's Shirley Augustine." The 3 exclamation marks expressed the urgency in its heart. No matter what, it didn't want to be treated as a magical creature. Shirley Augustine, according to her own words, is a little princess, Dake said as he turned around. Professor Shi Erfu frowned and observed carefully. "Is she a dungeon boss?" "Was she once?" Dake looked at the bear cub. The bear cub quickly erased the previous words and wrote again. "I'm famous in the Northern Kingdom, Ice Maiden. A strong desire to live." Dark explained, according to what it said, it began to awaken its intelligence when it was a tier boss, Snow Maiden, and recovered its memory. After it was attacked by the students, it didn't really die. Instead, it hibernated in the underground city until it reincarnated again as an elite monster, parasitic spirit. The bear cub, Ice Maiden, isn't the boss's name. It's my title when I was a human. Dake continued, "Of course, I don't think she's Shirley Augustine herself. If I have to explain, she's a product of the dungeon's projection and memory infusion. That's a clone of her soul and memory. Of course, she's also developed self-awareness." Professor Shi Erfu's frown deepened. The bear cub stole a glance at her expression and hurriedly wrote, "We have the same soul and memory. I'm Shirley Augustine herself." Dake squinted at it and said, "Life is divided into 3 parts: soul, consciousness, and body. The dungeon simulates the soul and body, but it doesn't give the magical creatures self-awareness. Therefore, all magical creatures are incomplete. They're the same type of simulated life as the enchanted elves. They only have basic intelligence and lack rationality. They don't have the ability to think for themselves and aren't afraid of spirituality. But now, with Bear Bao as an example, they've developed self-awareness for some unknown reason, just like my enchanted elves." At this point, Doc suddenly came to a realization. No wonder he felt that the bear cub was familiar. He finally knew what that familiar yet strange feeling was. The magical creatures in the dungeon were very similar to the enchanted elves. The only difference between them was that the enchanted elves were carried by the enchanted cards, while the magical creatures were carried by the dungeon. This difference caused the magical creatures in the dungeon to be more realistic than the usual enchanted elves. Therefore, the materials condensed after the magical creatures were hunted were real and usable. They could be brought out of the dungeon without disappearing. The reason why his enchanted elves had spiritual wisdom was that he added Great Sin when refining these enchanted elves, or he used Great Sin card to consecrate them. As for Great Sins, it was ultimately an ability of a demon god. He had been using the ability of the demon god. After repeated analysis, he gradually adopted it for his own use. Now, the magical creatures in the dungeon had developed self-awareness. Could it be because there were also higher-order gods in the dungeon that had awakened? According to Dake's interpretation of Eudora's first prophecy, the stars will fall, the sky will collapse, the gods will not be gods. That was the prophecy of the twilight of the gods. At the moment when the gods had already died out, this prophecy was too forward-looking. The gods had died, so how could they die again? Of course, they had to come back to life first. Therefore, this prophecy could also be said to be the prophecy of the twilight of the gods. The signs related to it had already appeared. Dake touched his card bag. Soul of the Moon God I was still lying in his bag. Now, in the Shang Malian Academy's dungeon, was there finally going to be a second god returning from the abyss? However, under the circumstances where he couldn't reveal the information of the demon god to Professor Shi Erfu, Dake couldn't explain his deduction process in detail. Moreover, he was actually in a guessing position. Whether it was the interpretation of the prophecy or the understanding of the dungeon's mechanism, it all belonged to him. He wasn't sure. In short, after saying everything he could, he stepped aside and let Professor Shi Erfu study it himself. Next, it was time for the professors to worry. As a small student, he was ready to withdraw from it. Professor Shi Erfu didn't take Xiong Bao away, nor did she stay for long. After a few words with Xiong Bao, she returned to the castle with Dake. Before parting ways, Professor Shi Erfu said, "We'll take care of the following matters, but can surely Augustine be temporarily placed in your club?" "It's not a big problem," Dake said. "But I need a collar." Professor Shi Erfu nodded and said, "I'll ask Ka Zayer to think of a way." Dake smiled and said, "Then it's not a problem." After all, magical animals were often treated as monsters. So, wasn't it normal for him to treat monsters as magical animals? "I'll give you the news before tonight." Professor Shi Erfu nodded and quickly left. Dake turned in another direction and quickened his pace. The next class was Professor Ka Zayer's Introduction to Magic. After the Introduction to Magic class, Dake went to find White and Luo Boat. White and Luo Boat were very surprised. After thinking carefully, they realized that Dake didn't take the initiative to look for them. Luo Boat even felt a little honored. Out of courtesy, Dake didn't directly discuss work matters. Instead, he invited them to have lunch together. The three of them, plus D. Anna and Luo C., made for a slightly larger group. They chatted on the way to the cafeteria. Dake actually had other thoughts, so he said to White, "How was it? Did you get anything in the dungeon?" "Okay." As soon as he mentioned the dungeon, he noticed that White's expression didn't look right, so his tone softened. However, White still nodded and said, "Not bad. Although it was really hard. If only Luo Boat was here." Luo Boat laughed dryly. Then, as if trying to salvage the atmosphere, he raised his voice and said, "Next time, definitely next time." Sigh. White sighed and said, "Do you know how dangerous it was when C. Keat and I accidentally entered that hidden room? I was so close to being in a huge debt." Luo Boat said loudly, "Wait, White. Why do you say it like it's my fault? Also, I know that if you complete the Safety First mission, you can get a dungeon escape device. You don't have to pay for it." White stared at him and said, "I haven't reached the 10th level yet." "Oh, no." Luo Boat was speechless for a while, then he explained, "Isn't that because your guide isn't good enough? I told you not to let C. Keat be your guide. There are so many seniors in the 3rd grade, even if you don't know them. But the seniors in our sports club are very nice. As long as I say you're looking for a guide, a lot of them will be willing." White secretly glanced at Dake and said to Luo Boat, "Luo Boat, it's hard to repay a debt of gratitude." Luo Boat said without hesitation, "How is this debt of gratitude, the seniors in our sports club?" Okay. White interrupted impatiently, "The seniors in our marine biology department are pretty nice. It's not like you don't know Senior Betty." Luo Boat said, "But Senior Betty is in the 5th grade." The two of them started arguing again and attracted a lot of attention. Dake, Luo C, and D. Anna subconsciously distanced themselves from the two of them. White and Luo Boat didn't shut up until they entered the cafeteria and lined up obediently. After getting their food, the five of them took their plates and found a table for 6. Victor and Robert rarely ate with anyone other than the two of them. As soon as they sat down, they excitedly asked, "Speaking of which, Dark, did you go to the dungeon alone?" "Yes," Dake said as he poured seasoning into the beef noodles. White asked curiously, "Aren't you afraid if you're alone? There were so many monsters. Didn't we have a magic elf?" Dake looked up and said, You're right." White was silent. Dake asked casually, "Did you accidentally enter a hidden room in the dungeon?" "Yes." White's eyes lit up and she said, "It was on the 4th level of the dungeon. C. Keat and I were chased by monsters. Ahem, we accidentally entered a dead end and crashed into the wall. We didn't expect there to be another world behind the wall, you don't know." Werther began to blabber on and on. Dake felt that this was how a child of this age should be, so he patiently listened to her. White and C. Keat did indeed have a strange encounter in the dungeon. The hidden room they accidentally entered was very large, like a miniature version of a maze. There were 2 treasure chests and a standard treasure chest in the maze. However, even the standard treasure chest was guarded by elite monsters. The two of them were almost sent out of the dungeon by the treasure chests and expended a lot of effort to finally kill the elite monsters guarding the treasure chest. In the end, they obtained the most valuable treasure since they entered the dungeon. Unfortunately, it wasn't a holy sword. Since it wasn't a holy sword, Dake didn't pay much attention to it. As a listener, he satisfied White's desire to talk. When White finished, Dake told her the real purpose of the trip. On Friday afternoon, the opening ceremony of the Silver Cup will be held. There will be a duel simulation competition, and we would like to invite you to participate. Dake didn't beat around the bush as he directly stated his purpose. White's face was still flushed with satisfaction as she said, "I'll help if you need anything." "Wait, the opening ceremony of the Silver Cup?" Dake smiled and said, "Yes. To put it bluntly, we would like you to advertise. Of course, it's under the name of the Brave Warrior." Only now did Werther truly understand. He couldn't help but ask, "A duel simulation game? The one with the dual disc?" "Yes." Dake nodded. White frowned and asked, "That's yours?" Dake said, "The Ultimate Duel Club is a club that I helped to establish." White immediately looked at Luo Boat and the two quickly communicated through their eyes. Luo Boat immediately said excitedly, "Can we get rare cards by participating in the exhibition competition?" Dake said with a strange expression, "Our predetermined reward is a certain amount of credits and suitable materials. If you want a rare card, I can discuss it with them." As soon as he said that, Luo Boat and White exchanged glances again. After a while, Luo Boat said, "What about customization? I mean, can we customize exclusive cards that only we have? For example, the Brave Warrior card?" Dake frowned slightly and looked at White. "Is this what you want?" White's expression changed. He took a breath and said, "No, I don't want that. To be honest, after what happened last school year, I don't want to be tied to my father's identity. I want to use my own ability. So, in the name of the Brave Warrior." Dake looked at him seriously and shook his head slightly. He said softly, "You should know that this isn't a restriction, but a vision. People call you the Brave Warrior because they want you to inherit the legacy of the Brave Warrior and become as brave as the Brave Warrior. Just like me, I don't mind people calling me the Valkyrie's son." White's grip on the fork suddenly tightened. This was a question that had been bothering him for the entire holiday. "It's not a restriction, but a vision?" White gritted his teeth and thought silently. Dake waited quietly. He wasn't in a hurry. His impression of White Gouda was neither good nor bad. He hadn't changed much since school started. In terms of favorability, it was around 45. However, he didn't want White to go astray. After all, the Demon King wasn't dead yet, and the brave warrior shouldn't be depressed. However, during the holiday, Dake learned about the dragon blood cancer from White and Claire. He also knew about the brave warrior's short lifespan, so he didn't support White to become a brave warrior. As for how the protagonist in the original game avoided a short lifespan after becoming a brave warrior, Dake didn't know because he didn't play the game. Moreover, the original game only lasted until the 6th grade. After that, it was probably just an epilogue with a few sentences. Or maybe it left a suspense for a sequel. In short, a game was just a game. Since this world turned into reality, everything had gone on a different path. After Dake finished his lunch, he took out a wet wipe from his cup and carefully wiped the corner of his mouth. 2 minutes later, White seemed to have thought it through. He looked up and said, "Are there any specific rules for a duel simulation? Do I use my own cards or the ones provided by the store? Also, who's my opponent?" Dake smiled and said, "Do you have anyone you want to duel? If not, how about Luo Boat?" White turned to look at Luo Boat and sighed in relief. "If Luo Boat is fine with it, then I'm fine with it too." Luo Boat was surprised. "I can do it too?" "Of course you can." Dake smiled and said, "This time, I chose the two of you because of your passion for the duel simulation. We need the audience to feel joy from your duel. That's the only way to promote the game." "Yes, I see." White and Luo Boat nodded. However, it didn't matter to them whether they understood or not. Being able to stand on the stage and be the spokesperson for their favorite game was enough to make them feel excited. They didn't even care about the credits and materials as a reward. They didn't even ask about it. Seeing how cooperative they were, Dake said, "Then let's not waste any time. Are you free this afternoon?" "Of course." Luo Boat said immediately. White also nodded. There were still 2 hours before potionology started at 2 in the afternoon. Teenagers were at their most energetic, so they didn't have to take a nap. After leaving the cafeteria, Dake asked White and Luo Boat to go back to the dormitory first. They took the dual disc and their respective card decks to the Magical Zoology Society on the Spiral Clock Tower. He went to the teacher's dormitory and found Eve and Irene in Claire's room. When they didn't have work or classes, the twins usually stayed in their rooms and occasionally went to the library to borrow books. Although they weren't talented enough, they were still learning the basics of magic. However, their progress was slow. "Did you agree?" Eve asked. Dake nodded and said, "Bring the contract and pen and meet at my society. If you have any other requests, such as adding some popular cards to your deck, you can also discuss with them." "Okay, no problem." Eve was immediately excited. Then, she followed Dake to the Magical Zoology Society. Dake was the middleman. After introducing Eve to White and Luo Boat, he didn't continue to manage the society. He took advantage of the lunch break to coax the little auntie. Then, he entered the study room and talked to Cub Bear. Although Shirley Augustine was a caged bird that was kept in the tower all year round, she was still a person of that era and had personal feelings and understanding of that era. Dake didn't ask about the details of her life in the dungeon. Instead, he tried to dissect her memories and find something useful. In fact, he was more interested in that period of history than Shirley herself. How did a kingdom that wasn't weak fall to ruin? In the process of resisting the invasion of the demon race, there were also those inspiring stories. Or perhaps, the royal family of the Northern Kingdom had some unknown secret? Dake specially brought fruits, pastries, and tea to pry some information out of Shirley's mouth. In fact, the awakening of the demons in the dungeon wasn't considered a crisis. Unless it was proven that a certain god was involved, the Academy had too many ways to suppress them. However, under this apparent crisis, there was a huge hidden treasure. Every demon that awakened their memories was a walking treasure chest. The memories in their heads were the greatest treasures. Dake realized this from the beginning. Now, he was just reaping the rewards. Unfortunately, Shirley Augustine didn't seem to want to chat with him for too long. Dake could feel that Cub Bear was afraid of him. So, after feeding her, Dake didn't force her to drink more. Instead, he left first. After all, he had plenty of time to drink more. After that, he might be able to write a book called The Rise and Fall of the Northern Kingdom. When he left the study room, he saw White and Luo both demonstrating a duel in the living room. Dake actually didn't watch much of a duel simulation, so he sat down and watched with interest. After simplifying the rules and cards, the duel simulation became a more popular game. With White and Luo both's skills, they were able to make good use of the little tricks that were specially designed to make the whole duel game look deep and easy to understand. In short, after watching their duel, the audience had the idea that, I can do it too. And this was one of the hidden reasons why they were chosen. After watching the simulated duel between the two of them, even Dark had to admit that they were indeed one of the best choices. Eve was obviously very satisfied. She signed a contract with the two and arranged a rehearsal time with them. After they left, Eve reminded him, "Master, don't forget that there's another team." Dake rolled his eyes and felt a little pressured. If the existence of White and Luo both was to let the audience understand and like the duel simulation, then the combination of Panduola and Winnie was to let the audience know that the duel simulation could also reach a certain level. But it wasn't easy to convince these two to participate. But for the sake of the society, Dake had to bite the bullet. After the afternoon potion lesson, Dake didn't return to his dorm. Instead, he went straight to the library. Since the start of the second year, he spent less and less time in the library. Other than the fact that he had to do less homework in the library, he also had another place to study in peace, which was the Magical Zoology Society. Basically, this was the current situation of the students in the Shang Malian Academy. Most of the students in the first year would stay in the library's reading room and the common room in the tower. But from the second year onwards, the club's classroom would become the main learning and activity area. Dake opened the door and entered the library. He saw Panduola, who had just sat down. Panduola Doragon was already in the 5th year, but she still hadn't quit her job as a librarian. Dake remembered that during the holidays, she had said that she wanted to recommend her mother to the school, but it seemed like it would take some time. "Good afternoon, Senior." Dake took the form and skillfully signed his name. Panduola patted the stool next to her and signaled him to come behind the counter. Dake didn't plan to leave, so he sat down next to her. Panduola yawned and asked tiredly, "Did you go to the dungeon during the weekend?" "Yeah." Dake nodded. Panduola smiled and suddenly said, "I went too." Dake blinked and complimented, "You must have gained a lot, right?" Panduola didn't answer directly. Instead, she looked at the entrance of the library and said, "When I came back last night, I heard that a monster appeared in the dungeon." Dake asked curiously, "What monster? Could it be that some other intelligent monster had been discovered?" Panduola described it. "It seems to be a little monster that can smell the treasure chest. Do you know where it is?" Dark paused for a moment, then looked away and said, "Who knows?" Panduola smiled and said, "How many treasure chests did you get in the dungeon this time?" Dake tapped his fingers and said, "I didn't count them." "Why?" Panduola suddenly turned her head and stared into his eyes. She said seriously, "Treasure chests are usually very dangerous. The first 10 levels aren't too dangerous for you. You can do that, but you have to be careful when you go deeper, okay?" Dake subconsciously leaned back to avoid the fragrance that entered his nose. Panduola looked at his embarrassment and stood up with a smile. She didn't force him. "You know, I can smell the scent of a tier boss." "No, I don't know." Dake wanted to say that, but he didn't say it. Panduola said slowly, "When we were in 1st grade, we didn't enter the dungeon. So when I was in 2nd grade, it was my first time entering the dungeon. The feeling it gave me was very safe, but also very boring." Dake stood up straight and chose to listen. Panduola continued, "The first 10 levels of the dungeon were difficult to find the way in the maze. But for me, who lived in a more complex environment, it was like a paper maze game. I could find the way even with my eyes closed. At first, I didn't realize that the scent I sensed when I first entered the dungeon belonged to a tier boss. It wasn't until I entered the 6th level that I found the scent because I was passing by. Then, I met the first tier boss in my life. I wasn't as strong as you. That tier boss was a big threat to me. But in the end, I defeated it. After that, I obtained precious treasures from the tier boss's treasure chest. That set the foundation for my future path. It was also from then on that I started to search for tier bosses like crazy. Strategy, crusade, loot, until I met it. At this point, Pandora paused for a moment. Dake listened attentively and asked, "Who?" "A tier boss." Panduola recalled, "A tier boss on the 17th level. To the current me, it might not be much. But at that time, the pressure it gave me was unforgettable. It was also at that time that I used my first dungeon escape device." In other words, her strategy had failed. A failed strategy to defeat the boss. For ordinary adventurers, this was actually a very common thing. As long as they didn't die in the strategy, they would attack the boss again and again. But ever since Panduola entered the dungeon, she had never failed. That could be said to be a very important turning point in her life. She wasn't like the adventurers outside. She had the dungeon escape device, which allowed her to survive. But without the dungeon escape device, that tier boss's blade would have pierced through her body. Seeing that Dake was listening attentively, Panduola said seriously, "So you have to be careful. Being able to find treasures easily isn't a good thing. Moderate greed can push us to grow, but excessive greed can only bring destruction. Without the dungeon escape device, you can't start over. Don't lose yourself." "I understand." Dake nodded in agreement. After a while, he asked curiously, "Senior, what was that tier boss like? Did you succeed in the crusade?" Panduola shook her head and said, "No. When I mustered up the courage to challenge it again, it was already gone. Maybe it was attacked by others, or maybe it was melted down by the dungeon. Who knows?" Dake asked, "Did it use a blade?" Panduola nodded, "Yes, it used a broadsword. Yesterday, I didn't feel well after the second injection. I forced myself to attend the engagement party and didn't dare to stay up late. Today, I had to wake up early to send someone off, so I didn't finish writing until now. As for today's update, I'll try to finish it before 6 a.m. Even so, it's still 10,000 words, 5 chapters." 227/233 Chapter 594. A Broadsword. Dake's eyes flashed as he immediately thought of the humanoid monster he encountered in the underground city. That humanoid monster appeared in the 6th room when they were fighting the boss, just before the Orc Blademaster appeared. It wore a bamboo hat and was dressed in black, with a broadsword hanging diagonally on its back. Its appearance was very imposing, and its every move was full of rationality. The lion beast had gone through a tough battle before he managed to kill it with the sure-kill skill of the Holy Sword. Thinking of this, Dake suddenly frowned and had doubts again. When the lion beast killed the humanoid monster, Dake found that the corpse was very strange. There were no muscles, blood vessels, or bones in its body, only a black substance that filled the insides. Before he could take a closer look, the humanoid monster's corpse suddenly shriveled up, leaving only a puddle of foul black liquid. Even among the strange monsters in the underground city, this kind of phenomenon after death was unusual. But when the corpse dissolved, the Orc Blademaster suddenly appeared, causing Dake's train of thought to be interrupted, and he temporarily put this matter to the back of his mind. Now that he thought about it, and connected it to the monsters in the underground city that gave birth to consciousness and recovered his memory. Remember the website, Vipkanshu. Dake suddenly had some ideas. "What did you think of?" Panduola suddenly asked. Dake thought for a while and described the humanoid monster's image. But when he said that, Panduola frowned and said hesitantly, "It's very similar." Dake's eyes flashed and said, "If I meet it again, I'll pay more attention." Panduola shook her head and said, "There's no need. But if it's really the same monster, it must have the ability to leave the boss room, and it's not that easy to meet it." "That's true." Dake did not continue. He then chatted with Panduola for a while before he talked about the purpose of this trip. Panduola was a little surprised. "So you were the one who made that game that makes people lose their will to play?" Doc's gaze drifted and he laughed. Spiritual entertainment is also very important. He wouldn't tell his senior sister Panduola that simulated duels could help one improve. Although there were such effects, it was just a byproduct of entertainment. If one really wanted to improve their dueling skills, there were many ways to do so that were faster and more effective than dueling simulation games. The essence of a duel simulation game was still a game, not a duel. Dake's initial motive for creating a simulated duel was to start a business, to make money. Therefore, when it came to business, he directly told Panduola about the rewards that the nationwide duel club could promise. Then, he asked Panduola to consider it himself. However, after Senior Panduola heard this, she was clearly moved. But it was different from what Dake had imagined. The reason for Panduola's interest had nothing to do with the reward. After thinking for a while, she said, "Is Claire Kate also a member of your society?" Dake nodded and said, "Yes, she is currently the biggest person in charge of the nationwide duel club." Panduola's eyes lit up, and she said, "Then, can you use her connections to help me do something?" Dake asked, "What is it?" Panduola said, "Actually, my mother ran into trouble in the process of applying for a position as a professor in the academy. She needs a guarantor who can obtain the recognition of the academy." Dake was puzzled. "Aunt Hephaestus? I remember that she wanted to apply for a position as a professor of magical beasts." Panduola nodded and said, "Yes. The first grade still lacks a probationary professor who can teach magical beasts in their interest class." "Like Professor Nini?" Dake thought for a while. Panduola said, "In short, if you can help my mother enter the academy and become a professor, I will owe you a huge favor. Not to mention this exhibition match, I can even accept any advertisement endorsement in the future. You know, my popularity is not bad." It was more than not bad. Dake couldn't help but laugh. "Although I really want to settle it, I still need Aunt Claire to understand the real situation before I make a decision. But I don't think it's a big problem." Panduola was clearly happy. "I hope so. I've been troubled by this matter recently. Fortunately, I have you." Dake shook his head. "You could have come to me earlier." Panduola said shyly, "I haven't thought of what to give in exchange, have I? By the way, Senior, how is your relationship with Senior Winnie?" Dake thought for a while and asked, "Winnie Scarty?" Panduola was puzzled. Dake nodded and said, "Yes, we want to invite her to be your opponent." "You really are greedy." Panduola was a little dissatisfied. "Isn't it enough to have me?" Dake hurriedly said, "How can you say that? Of course, a duel needs 2 contestants." "Of course I know that, but aren't there 2 people here?" Panduola raised her hand and pointed at herself and Dake. Dake said helplessly, "But our strength isn't equal." Panduola blinked and said, "It seems that in your eyes, Winnie and I are equal in strength?" "No." Dake hurriedly said, "I mean, perhaps in the eyes of the audience, your positions are quite similar. Also, we already have a male team, so we need another female team." "Male team?" Panduola frowned slightly. "Who is that?" Dake said, "White and Luo Boat. It's the hero's son, and his followers." "Oh." Panduola said uninterestedly, "Winnie it is. But I don't know her well." Dake said regretfully, "There's no other way. I'll have to think of a way myself." "No." Panduola didn't know why, but she suddenly said, "I can try." Dake said in surprise, "Really?" Pandora said sternly, "After all, my deal with you isn't equal. I have to pay a little more." Dake said, "Don't be so serious." Panduola shook her head and said, "Didn't you just learn alchemy? This is an equivalent exchange." Dake knew that he couldn't refuse, so he could only enjoy it. The conversation between the two went very smoothly, and they agreed to meet on Wednesday afternoon at the Magical Animal Society for the final discussion. Dake hurriedly went to Claire's dormitory again. This time he was lucky. Claire was reading on the balcony. He told her a little about Panduola's mother, Hephaestus Doragon's job search. Claire pondered for a moment before agreeing. "Hephaestus is a sinner, so it's normal for her to need someone to vouch for her. Leave it to me, Claire said. Then there's no problem. Dake couldn't help but heave a sigh of relief. He actually didn't like this kind of thing. But there were some things that he had to do even if he didn't like it. Fortunately, the outcome pointed to the ideal situation. However, before the meeting on Wednesday, nothing had been decided yet. As the middleman, his main job was to bring people from both sides together. He wouldn't participate in the specific discussions when the time came. I hope everything goes well, Dake said. It will. Claire sat up from the recliner and walked to the bedroom. Dake asked, Are you going out? Claire smiled and said, Didn't you agree to meet Shi Erfu at night? It just so happens that I have something to talk to her about. She's also in charge of Hephaestus's inauguration, right? Dake thought for a moment and said, That's true. Claire gestured and entered the bedroom. When she came out again, she had already changed into her traveling clothes. The two walked out of the teacher's dormitory and went to the cafeteria to have dinner. Then, they went to the castle's window to enjoy the breeze before going to the Magical Zoology Society's classroom. 3 minutes later, Professor Shi Erfu arrived as if he could predict the future. Claire, you're here too? Professor Shi Erfu was slightly surprised. Claire smiled and said, Yes, Professor. There are some things to discuss. Good. Professor Shi Erfu smiled and said, I also have something to discuss with you. Claire guessed, Is it about the monsters? Professor Shi Erfu smiled calmly and said, You already know? Claire pointed behind her and smiled. Little Bear is hiding behind the door and eavesdropping. I haven't had the time to take a look yet. Professor Sylph looked over and said, It's not a big deal, but it's not a small one either. But we can't just leave it be. It might still be in the early stages, but if we leave it to ferment, the chances of accidents will increase infinitely. We need to organize an exploration team as soon as possible to find out the truth. There might really be unexpected variables happening in the underground city. Claire went straight to the heart of the matter. Who will lead the team? Shi Erfu said, I will lead the team myself. Dake poured tea for the two elders while listening. Professor Shi Erfu attached great importance to this matter, which was also in line with his expectations. At the beginning, they would send the best team to carry out a dimensionality reduction attack on the intelligent monsters in the underground city. They had to nip the danger in the bud with lightning speed. Even if there was a god awakening in the underground city, it might still be able to issue a challenge. The path of magic was originally a path to godhood. Professor, can I go with you? Dake took the opportunity to ask. Professor Shi Erfu took a sip of tea and looked up at him. You're not going to participate in the opening ceremony of the Silver Cup? Dake was surprised. We're leaving this week? Claire frowned slightly and said, It's too early. If what happened in the underground city is really far-reaching, we need more preparation. Professor Shi Erfu said slowly, There's no time to lose. Claire shook her head and said, It's better to be prepared. Dake took a deep breath and sat down. Let's prepare more. Although there's no evidence, I feel that the reason why those monsters can develop consciousness and intelligence is related to the gods. Professor Shi Erfu was not surprised. This is more exciting, isn't it? Dake suggested, Next week. Professor Shi Erfu smiled. Then the time will not be decided. Doc heaved a sigh of relief. He really wanted to tag along. It had been a month since school started, but he had made no progress in the study of the great sins. The improvement of the great sins was also nowhere in sight. He had no clue at all. He had a thought, but he did not know if it was correct. The great sins might have already involved the realm of the gods. The magic pattern transformed from the mural in the temple itself was something from the gods. Perhaps the gods in the underground city could bring him a breakthrough. Moreover, since Professor Shi Erfu and Claire were going to lead the team this time, the danger of going deep into the underground city would be reduced to the minimum. If he could not get on the team this time, it might be difficult to find a similar opportunity again. However, Professor Shi Erfu did not immediately agree. The only good thing was that Professor Shi Erfu did not explicitly refuse. From the professor's point of view, it was impossible for him to let a second-year student join an exploration team of this level. However, Dake's research on the intelligence of the magic elves was very compatible with this incident. Even Professor Shi Erfu had to admit that they might really need him. However, the exploration team was still in the preparation stage. They had not even gathered all the members, so they could not rush. There were indeed many capable professors in the Shangmalian Academy, but not all of them were good at fighting. Even if they were good at fighting, they were divided into those who were active and those who were not. Moreover, although this matter was not obvious in the early stages, it was easy to speculate the depth of the situation in the later stages. If this spread out, it would not be a good thing for the Shangmalian Academy. Therefore, they had to be very careful in the selection of members. The only members that Professor Shi Erfu had confirmed so far were Claire and Professor Pawa Cheong-si, who had just been recruited. Even Professor Kazel was only on the list for the time being. By the way, this is the suppression lock that Ka Zayer hurriedly made. Put it on that monster. Professor Shi Erfu took out a pair of jade bracelets the size of a bracelet and handed them to Dake. Dake took the jade bracelets and observed them carefully. This pair of jade bracelets, called the suppression lock, were almost flawless in appearance. There was a hint of green in the white. However, on the inside of the jade bracelets, there was a complicated circuit engraved like a circuit board. The word lock could be seen on the inside of one of the jade bracelets. The word create was engraved on the inside of the other jade bracelets. Lock is the binding device, and create is the key. Professor Shi Erfu explained, after putting it on, you only need to inject magic power into it, and it will become a brand that will adhere to the skin. As long as the person wearing the key has more magic power than the person wearing the binding device, it will be able to suppress the monster in all aspects. Dake quickly understood how to use the suppression lock. Under Professor Shi Erfu's instructions, he walked to the study room. As soon as he opened the door of the study room, he found 4 people and a bear hiding inside. Katrina, Brittany, Deanna, Luo C, and Cub were all hiding inside to eavesdrop. Hee. Deanna took a step back and hid her hands behind her back. She bent down to look at the jade bracelets in Dake's hands and asked curiously, "What is this?" "Suppression lock. Didn't you hear it?" Dake said as he grabbed the back of Baby Bear's neck with one hand and sat down on the sofa. Even though Cub Bear was struggling, he was still pinned down by Dark on his thigh. Then, it grabbed the little bear cub's left arm and put the jade bracelet with the lock engraved on it. It was visible to the naked eye that it was loosening. "Is it too big?" Dake had no choice but to take out the jade bracelet and stare at Baby Bear's neck. Woo! Little bear cub immediately sensed something and tried to run away. However, when Dake lifted it up, its 4 limbs were suspended in the air, and it could only flail about in the air like a dog paddle. No matter how strong it was, it couldn't run without its feet touching the ground. Dake squinted his eyes and grinned. He grabbed Dake's head and rubbed it flat, as expected of the parasitic shell of a parasite. It was just like a teddy bear that could be kneaded and flattened at will. Dake quickly put the jade bracelet on Baby Bear's neck. Although the jade bracelet was a little subtle because it didn't have a fitting device, its suppression effect was real. Dake put the other jade bracelet on his left wrist and injected magic into them. The 2 jade bracelets melted into his skin one after another, leaving only 2 faint stripes. Dake immediately sensed that there was an invisible line between him and Baby Bear. Through this line, he could clearly sense the flow of magic in Baby Bear's body and its location. Then, he only needed to inject magic into the stripes on his wrist to suppress the flow of magic. He could even make the stripes produce a binding force and physically shrink it. This set of magic tools that Ka Zayer's classroom rushed out at the last minute was indeed quite useful. Dake raised his hand and did a small experiment. The next moment, Baby Bear's neck suddenly tightened, and the flow of magic in its body was instantly cut off. The whole bear was like a frosted eggplant. The effect is not bad. Dake removed the suppression, and couldn't help but smile. With the suppression lock, He could finally raise monsters in the club classroom without worry. But Baby Bear, whose limbs were dangling, couldn't smile no matter what. A living room. After Dake left, Professor Shi Erfu and Claire looked up at the sky at the same time. Then, from the ceiling, a human head popped out. Professor Li, who was making a funny face, was glared at by Professor Shi Erfu, but she couldn't help but laugh. Professor Shi Erfu was too lazy to care about her and asked, "If Dake comes along, you'll be responsible for his safety." Bingo! Professor Li put her right index finger and thumb into a circle and pressed it on her big round eyes like a monocle. Her face was full of excitement. Something interesting finally happened. The fairy's curiosity was about to jump out of her chest. Li knew very well that under normal circumstances, she wouldn't be on the list of Professor Shi Erfu's team members. But since she eavesdropped, everything was out of Shi Erfu's control. But now, it seemed that Shi Erfu was quite sensible. She thought to herself happily. Seeing Professor Li shrink back from the ceiling, Claire's lips curled up into a meaningful smile. Little Fairy is still as naive as before. She doesn't realize that Shi Erfu has put a lock on her. Little Dake is her suppression lock. Professor Shi Erfu and Claire didn't talk for too long. They called Li and returned to the faculty dormitory to continue the in-depth discussion. After the professors left, the atmosphere in the Magical Zoology Society finally became lively. Katrina and Brittany were sitting around the guest table, excitedly guessing how thrilling and exciting the professor's trip to the dungeon would be. Their envious gazes penetrated the walls as they looked at their president, who was likely to accompany them. Anna and Luo C rushed to do their homework. Little Auntie Bird, who escaped from the room, jumped on the table and caused trouble everywhere. In the study room, Dake continued to pry the bright red melon out of the bear cub's mouth and ate it in big mouthfuls. It wasn't until 9:30 that Dake reluctantly left the Magical Zoology Society and returned to the dormitory with some of the enchanted fairies. Then, he waited for Aurora, who came to deliver supper. He chatted with her about the study and life in Victoria and Phoenix. They also discussed the teaching content of the mathematics lesson. Dake didn't forget his duty as a teaching assistant. He spent some time preparing before he washed up and meditation. Deep into the night, he laid on his bed and looked at the ceiling. The system list of great sins gradually appeared in front of his eyes. The situation of great sins this month was not good. Pride, 91-92, envy, 42-43, rage, 83-92, sloth, 63-60, greed, 92-98, gluttony, 79-87, bliss, 91-93. On the 10th of September, the situation was still good. However, after only 20 days, everything seemed to have collapsed. The situation on the list looked like a mountain road that had been ravaged by a mudslide. There were mountains of mud and sand everywhere. Doc blinked and quickly reflected on his actions. In September, he drew 2 points of pride, 10 points of bliss, and 8 points of greed. However, after drawing so many points, it still couldn't make up for the increase. Among them, pride was restrained, and the net increase was only 1 point. Envious fluctuation was not a big deal. Sloth was the only one that decreased. This meant that he was diligent enough in September to even gain the recognition of sloth. Bliss was still increasing, but because he had drawn 10 points, it was barely stable. Other than that, the other 3 great sins were the most severe disaster areas. Rage had jumped from 83 points to 92 points because of Gate of Truth, and it had crossed the threshold to be drawn. Gluttony had also increased from 79 points to 87 points because of Midnight Snack Trap, which was an increase of 8 points. With another 3 points, gluttony would also cross the threshold. The situation was very serious. The scariest thing was that gluttony was different from rage. It was accumulated every day, and it would continue to accumulate if nothing went wrong. Even so, it was far less than greed. Under the premise that 8 points were drawn, greed had a net increase of 6 points. It had reached a peak of 98 points. When Dake felt that something was wrong, he had restrained himself. However, the dungeon was a devil's den that stimulated greed, and he had nowhere to hide. Every time Trash Slime evolved, every time he found a treasure chest, his greed could not be controlled. However, he had no choice. Opening treasure chests was too enjoyable. After this dungeon adventure, Dake knew that he could not resist the temptation of treasure chests. There were only two ways to control his greed. The first method was to leave Trash Slime in the hostel or club classroom and not bring it into the dungeon. The second method was to reduce the number of dungeon adventures and not enter the dungeon at all. At the thought of how he was still worried about not having enough great sins to absorb in the first half of September, Dark felt that he was sometimes too naive. He calculated the remaining reserves of great sins. Pride, 2 greed, 5 bliss, 7 the remaining amount was still acceptable. Currently, the great sins, with more than 90 points that could be absorbed were pride, 2 rage, 2 greed, 8 bliss. 3 he had a total of 15 points. This was all that could be drawn in a month before the underworld spiritual spell reached the beginner level. Even if the underworld spiritual spell reached the beginner level, there would only be an additional 5 points. If he could hitch a ride with the professors in October, he would have to enter the dungeon at least once. But that would be Friday the 11th of October. It would not affect the drawing plan in October. Dake glanced at Gluttony and thought that he had potential. I'll draw as many points as I can. The silver cup on the 4th is also a hurdle. Bitter. Treasure. Bitter. The next day, Dake threw the Year 1 students into the mathematics ocean for 1.5 hours before completing the History of Magic and Magical Beasts classes. Professor Ryan Hicks had written about many heroes who had appeared in history in the History of Magic. Professor Nini used a unique teaching method. She let the students talk about the dangerous magical beasts that they encountered in the dungeon. Then, she selected students to answer the questions about how to deal with the magical beasts. After the questions and answers, the magical beasts class came to an end. Even the students were not satisfied yet. After the magical beasts class, Dake was finally free to create the Dungeon Storage Box Eye. Though the Dungeon Storage Box Eye was categorized as an item card, it was more like a curse. As it was only a level 1 storage box, the difficulty of creating it was not high. Otherwise, it would not have been given as a Year 2 newbie mission. Dake spent 2 hours researching and finally completed the creation before dinner. As the dungeon storage box could only be opened in the Shang Malian College dungeon, it could not be verified. He could only bring the dungeon storage box to the mission hall and let the staff decide. Luckily, he completed the Safety First mission and received the mission reward, the Dungeon Escape Device. I finally have my own Dungeon Escape Device! Dake was in a good mood. He did not go to the club classroom. Instead, he returned to the dormitory after dinner. The treasures he obtained from the dungeon were piled up in the dormitory, especially the Blood Sacred Sword and Emerald Sacred Sword. They seemed to be shouting for him to deal with them quickly. It was a pity that he was tied up with mundane matters and did not have time to deal with them. Dake was not prepared to deal with the Blood Sacred Sword. As for the Emerald Sacred Sword, he planned to use the Single Scabbard as a reference to create a Pokemon-type Magic Guide Spirit. Let me see what materials were used to create the Single Scabbard. He sat down in front of the desk and flipped open his notebook. First, there is a Sacred Sword. Then, there is the Elven Wine, used to recover mana. Of course, I don't really need it now. Then, there is the secondary core, Jade Shield Turtle, 3 points, Greed. The Emerald Sacred Sword is a Grass-type Sacred Sword. If it is successful, it can only be a Grass and Fighting-type Sword Saint, Polygon. Picture Polygon's race value in the Pokemon game is as high as 580. It is even higher than Fire-Breathing Dragon and other Pokemon. If enough precious materials are used to create it, it is very possible to create a third-tier Magic Guide Spirit. Now that the vampire's daughter is being raised, it is very likely to become the new face. So, I have to be careful. Dake picked up the pen and carefully considered it. Since Polygon is a grass type, it should be compatible with Jupiter in theory. The corresponding great sin is stuck. Pride is the sun, bliss is the moon, greed is Saturn, envy, Mercury. Then only sloth, fury, and gluttony are left. Forget it, there is no rush. I will draw fury tonight to analyze it. Then, I can further narrow down the range. Now, the main thing is to choose the secondary materials. Single scabbard is only a 4-star magic guide spirit. If Polygon is at least a 7-star, it might need more secondary materials, and its value will be higher. Let me see if there are any materials that can be used. Thinking of this, Dake got up and started searching. Not long after, he returned to his seat and temporarily gave up. Polygon was a type of Pokemon similar to antelopes and deers. If he chose a secondary core, in theory, he should choose this direction. However, he did not have this type of material. Even among the grass-type materials, the only ones that were more valuable were the wooden carving and the flower of dreams. Troubled. In this case, I can only put the Emerald Holy Sword away for now. Dake could not help but frown. When he opened the treasure chest, he felt so good, but when he was dealing with it, he realized how difficult it was. The 2 holy swords cannot be used in the current situation. I can only start with other treasures. At least before entering the dungeon next time, I have to increase my effective combat power. In order of value, the Blood Crystal Crown and the Magic Fire are next. As for whether the Dragon Tooth Sword was forged with a dragon tooth, what kind of creature's information is recorded in the biological pearl? Was that map a treasure map or not? What kind of potion is in the bottle? What is the dropped item of the Soul Flayer? What kind of creature does the blood of the blood crystal belong to? There are still many things that need to be researched. For now, let's start with the magic fire. At least I can understand the words in this magic book. Moreover, it is a high-level magic book that can guide a mage to learn magic. Doc quickly calmed himself down and flipped open the spellbook. The first page of the magic fire had a hexagram array just like the cover. The next page was the title of the book and the line of words. The magic fire burns fiercely, and no one knows where it belongs. When he was in the dungeon, he could not really calm down and comprehend it. Now that he looked at this line of words, Dake suddenly had a taste of it. Then he raised his hand and raised his index finger. Poof! A gray-colored flame the size of a grain of rice instantly rose and jumped on his fingertip. This is... He had an idea and opened his palm again. The real, underworld fire came out from his palm. Both were gray and emitted a similar aura, but the underworld fire was obviously colder and more vigorous. Dake seemed to have understood something. When he first obtained the magic fire in the dungeon, Dake had grasped the basic method of transforming magic into magic fire, under the guidance of this magic book. However, the nature of magic fire changed according to the magic power. Dake had not carefully studied his magic power, but he had always hidden an underworld fire in his palm that was closest to his right index finger. Now, with a thought, he could use magic power to simulate a flame that was similar to the underworld fire. If he could simulate the underworld fire, then what about other types of flames? Dake suddenly focused and looked at his finger, guiding the magic power to change. In the next moment, a golden flame ignited on his middle finger. The golden flame was as dazzling as the sun and emitted a strong, arrogant aura. "Little demon," Dake subconsciously called out. The little demon flew down and stood at the corner of the table. Then, it also stared at the flame in Dake's hand. However, the difference was that its forehead was sweating. "Hey, dear master, don't tell me you're thinking of..." Dake slowly extended the golden flame towards it. "Be good." "No, not good." The little demon shook its head and turned to escape. The little demon did not want to become a little demon's meat. Dake smiled and retracted his hand. No matter how bad he was, he would not use fire to burn his own familiar. It was just a subconscious action. This golden flame was different from the gray, underworld fire. It had a very high temperature. He tore off a bit of the draft paper and placed it in the golden flame. Then, it ignited instantly. It has the basic characteristics of a flame, and it should have the ability to affect one's emotions to a certain extent. After confirming, Dake withdrew all the flames in his hand. Then, he extended his index finger again and focused slightly. A pink flame with a transparent center ignited at the tip of his finger. If the golden one is the pride fire, then this pink one is the bliss fire. He flicked his middle finger, and a bluish-purple flame rose into the air. This blue one is the greed fire. 3 flames, 3 characteristics. Dake tested them one by one and finally came to a conclusion. The pride fire had the highest temperature, the greed fire had the strongest burning ability, and the bliss fire lasted the longest. Other than these 3 flames of great sins, the other 4 flames were difficult to use. Dake withdrew the flames and continued to focus on magic fire. However, at this moment, his interest in this magic book was even stronger. After mastering the most basic technique of transforming magic into flames, he could now turn to the 3rd page. The 3rd page of Magic Fire was the contents page. 1st chapter, Magic Fire 2nd chapter, Soul Fire 3rd chapter, Void Fire 4th chapter, Undying Fire 5th chapter. Forbidden Fire. There were a total of 5 chapters, describing 5 different types of magic fire. Dake's attention was attracted by the 2nd chapter, Soul Fire, at first glance. He couldn't wait to try the 2nd chapter, then he immediately developed. This magic book could only be flipped page by page. Then what's the page number of this table of contents? His face darkened as he turned to the 4th page. The first line of the 4th page was, 1st chapter, Magic Fire. In order to reach the Soul Fire, Dake had to patiently flip through it. The 1st chapter mainly talked about the physical application of magic fire, which was the magic fire materialization. It compressed and condensed the magic fire into a solid form, which could then be turned into a sword, spear, halberd, or any kind of weapon. It could also be condensed into armor, shields, and other defensive equipment. Although he had some understanding of this part, it was still not as good as the Soul Fire. However, when he couldn't wait to turn to the 2nd chapter, he found that he couldn't turn it. Obviously, before completely mastering the 1st chapter, unless he cracked it by force, he couldn't see the contents of the 2nd chapter, Soul Fire. Dake could only suppress his impatience and patiently flip to the 1st chapter. Originally, to him, this demon fire was a pleasant surprise. Now, it was just a pleasant surprise within a pleasant surprise. Once he learned the usage of the Soul Fire, his research on spiritual power would definitely reach a new level, and he would be able to draw out spiritual power and trigger fetters at will. It wouldn't be like now, where he had to use the Tri-Flower spell to cast the Spirit Furnace and trigger fetters. No rush, no rush. Don't be too greedy. October is a month of abstinence. During the dueling class on Wednesday, Professor Cheong-si reminded the qualified students to not forget to sign up for the Silver Cup before announcing the end of the class. Dake picked up a portion of his loot from the dungeon and brought it to the Magical Zoology Society. This afternoon, there would be a gathering of the Ultimate Dueling Society in the classroom. Not only would Senior Pan Duola bring Senior Winnie along, but Aunt Claire would also be there with Eve and Erin. After their discussion, Dake would take the opportunity to ask them some questions. For example, was the dragon tooth sword really made from dragon teeth? The material value of the dragon tooth sword wasn't low. If it was really made from dragon teeth, it could be used as a rare dragon-type material. If Dake wanted to research the directional refinement of the blue-eyed white dragon, he would have a huge demand for such dragon-type materials. Even if he didn't use them to refine the blue-eyed white dragon, he could use them to refine other dragon types or special potions. With the size of this dragon tooth sword, it should be able to be used for a long time after grinding it into powder, right? He couldn't help but think. It's only 1 a.m. I can still do it. 230/233, 3 chapters left. I'll be done with 10,000 more words. Please vote. Chapter 595. At the bottom of the spiral clock tower. Winnie Scaldi and Panduola Doragon walked side by side. Is it on the 10th floor? Winnie raised her head slightly and looked at the spiral clock tower. She frowned slightly. Can't we find a classroom near the library? You can complain loudly during the discussion. Panduola said casually and climbed the stairs first. Although she was not familiar with Winnie, they were both girls from the magic school and were in the same club. Although Panduola was only a member in name, she was still a member of the literature club. Therefore, it was easy for her to find Winnie. She didn't even have to say much to get Winnie's approval. As for why, it was probably because Winnie wanted to take the opportunity to compete with her. This was the first time for both sides to play a duel game. Whether it was the mastery of the rules or the understanding of the cards, they had to start from the same starting point. There was no difference in experience. It was a competition of IQ. Remember, https://m. Vipkanchu. VIP. There were not many opportunities like this. Although Winnie's temperament was mild, she would fight when it was necessary. Otherwise, she would not have represented the magic school in the school championship. As the first seat of the magic school, she had always regarded Panduola as her target and opponent. It was just that it was rare for her to have a face-to-face confrontation. Although this duel game was only an exhibition match, it was because it was an exhibition match that she could give it her all. Therefore, she closed the book in her hand and followed Panduola's footsteps. But these 10 stairs were really deadly. When Winnie and Panduola reached the 10th floor of the spiral clock tower, Claire and Eve were already having afternoon tea in the club classroom. Compared to White and Luo Boat, they obviously valued the strong duo of Winnie and Panduola more. Although White had the identity of Hero's son, his popularity had been dwindling for a year, and his condition was not particularly good. Panduola and Winnie were the most popular celebrity duelists. Any one of them would cause cheers, not to mention the duel between the two of them. Claire could already imagine the enthusiasm of the opening ceremony of the Silver Cup. After White and Luo Boat successfully warmed up the battle simulation, Panduola and Winnie's appearance on stage would definitely send the entire battle arena into a frenzy. When the time came, all the major media outlets would publish advertisements for the duel simulation game at the same time, letting the entire kingdom citizens know about the existence of such a universal duel game. When material conditions become abundant, the barrenness of spiritual life will become apparent. Simulated duels would take advantage of this gap and occupy this huge market. Claire put down the teacup, turned her head slightly, and heard 2 people knocking on the door. Pitter-patter. The little devil beast flapped its wings and went to open the door. Good afternoon, little demon beast. Panduola raised his hand and let the little devil beast rest on the back of his hand, poking its head. The little demonic beast narrowed its eyes, and a satisfied expression appeared on its face. But Winnie only glanced at it, and then looked inside. The living room was separated by a wooden wall, and there were many small decorations, and the bonsai in the corner exuded a strange aura. There was an unfinished book on the sofa, and there was a silver tea set on the tea table used for guests. The Sage of Beasts, Claire and the twins, whom she had never seen before, were sitting opposite each other. The 3 of them had already turned their attention to her. Winnie smiled at them, but she didn't jump over Panduola to greet them. The 2 closed the door and walked to the tea table, and then Panduola said, "Good afternoon, Aunt Claire, and Eve. And Eve and Eileen, we just met over the weekend. I wanted to greet you, but the shop is too busy." Evelyn was cold, but Eve was more enthusiastic. "I wanted to greet you, but the shop is too busy. Seems like you all know each other." Winnie said, "I'm Winnie Scaldi, and I'm here by invitation." "Hello, Claire Kate." Claire reached out her hand to Winnie. Winnie shook her hand politely, and they were considered to have met each other. "Come, sit down." Eve got up and pulled out chairs, and invited the two to sit down. In this way, everyone who was attending the meeting was present. Eve was about to get straight to the point, but Panduola asked, "Where's Dake? Is he not here?" "He's inside." Claire pointed at the reading room, in the club's classroom. Obviously, Dake Dimeng was here again. Panduola nodded and sat down. Eve took a deep breath and said, "I believe the two of you are very clear that we will be holding a mock duel during the opening ceremony of the Silver Cup this Friday afternoon, and we will use this opportunity to promote the mock duel to the public. This mock duel was designed by young Master Dimeng, and we, the People's Duel Club, and the Shangmalian Academy work together to develop a duel game for everyone. This is our promotional brochure." Then, she pushed the two brochures to Panduola and Winnie. The two of them took the brochures and started reading. The brochures were very delicate, and it was obvious that a lot of effort was put into it. Panduola and Winnie both knew about the mock duel that had been popular in the academy for quite some time, but they didn't have much interest in it before, so they didn't know much about it. Now that they looked at the rules in the brochures, they were finally confident. "It's a very good design." Panduola closed the brochure after reading it and said, "I want to see the illustrations of the game cards." Eve took out another brochure and handed it over. "This is the first version of the cards. Because it's in the early testing stage, there aren't too many complicated types." Panduola nodded. "Since it's for the people, it can't be too complicated." Eve said, "Although that's the case, we will gradually go deeper according to the market's reaction, and add new cards to increase the game's strategy. Although it's definitely not at the level of a magic duel, we will try to add as much depth as possible." "Give me a copy of the illustration too," Winnie said. When the illustration was in her hands, Winnie also looked at it carefully. After about 10 minutes, the two put down the illustration almost at the same time. They looked at each other and noticed that they had the same thought in each other's eyes. "It's too simple." The mock duel did have some gameplay, but the first version of the cards was very simple. If they didn't have all the cards in their hands, they might be able to build it. But if they could choose from the full set of cards, it wouldn't be difficult at all. If nothing unexpected happened, the two of them might even build a deck that was basically the same. In that case, the so-called duel would become a pure competition of luck. Although Panduola didn't care, Winnie obviously didn't want that. "Are you all here?" Just as the two were thinking about it, Dake finally walked out of the reading room. He came to the tea table, greeted the two seniors, sat down, and poured himself a cup of tea. After taking a sip of the tea, Dake asked, "How was the chat?" "It was all right," Panduola said casually. She actually wanted to fast forward to the reward segment and talk to Claire about Hephaestus' work. However, Winnie said, other than the deck construction and the duel method, everything else was all right. Panduola looked at her and didn't say a word. Claire was also smiling and didn't say much. Eve quickly said, "There are no requirements for the deck construction. We can provide all the cards in the illustration for you to choose. As for the duel method, it will naturally be an exciting exhibition match." As Eve spoke, she suddenly realized that Erin tugged at her secretly. She paused and realized that Winnie had knitted her brows. It was apparent that Winnie wasn't interested in what she said. But what did he do to make her unhappy? Eve couldn't figure it out immediately. Dake observed Winnie's expression and said, "Even if it's an exhibition match, you should give it your all, right? The outcome has nothing to do with whether it's exciting or not. As for the deck construction, I have a method here. See if it works." "What method?" Winnie asked. Dake smiled and said, "The HP of the simulated duel is 8,000 points. Each duelist can only carry 40 cards, and there can only be 3 cards of the same type in a deck. Why don't we provide 3 cards of all the cards on the spot and form a common card pool? Then, both duelists will take turns to choose from the card pool and construct the deck on the spot. Then, they will use the deck for the duel. What do you think? Take turns to choose and construct the deck on the spot." Winnie couldn't help but ponder. Pandora's interest was suddenly piqued. "Sounds interesting." Winnie thought for a moment and said, "It's indeed a good method. I have no objections." Then it's settled. Dake made the decision. Before Eve and Erin could react, the exhibition match changed to a new format. Seeing that no one objected, Dake said, "Don't forget to inform White and Luo Boat. Let's talk about the reward. Senior Winnie, do you have any special requests?" Winnie smiled and shook her head. "No, I don't. But since it's an exhibition match, do we need to prepare formal attire?" Dake blinked and looked at Panduola. Formal attire was good. He hadn't seen her wear formal attire since Christmas. But he still rejected it. "Since it's an exhibition match, let's wear the school uniform. Students are our label, aren't they? So, Senior Panduola, what's your request?" "I've already told you my request," Panduola said calmly. Dake nodded and looked at Claire. Claire said, "Erin, take out the letter of guarantee." "Okay." Erin responded and immediately took out a file from her bag. She placed it on the table and pushed it to Panduola. Pandora's mind moved, and she immediately picked up the file and opened it. Inside was the letter of guarantee that Claire had signed for Hephaestus. Panduola was slightly moved, but she quickly calmed down. She put the letter of guarantee back into the file and asked, "Can I take it back?" "That won't do." Claire smiled. "This is just a copy. The original has been submitted. I think we'll be able to see Hephaestus in the academy soon." Panduola was pleasantly surprised. "Really?" Claire smiled and said, "It's because she meets the academy's requirements. Otherwise, she wouldn't be able to enter. If she's fast enough, she might even be able to participate in the opening ceremony of the Silver Cup." Winnie looked at Panduola's rare expression and finally understood why she agreed to the invitation for a mock duel. She originally thought that Panduola only agreed to the invitation because she had a good relationship with the young man opposite her. So there was another reason. "But Hephaestus is her relative? Isn't she an orphan?" Winnie's inner cat quietly poked her head out. Both parties quickly signed the cooperation agreement. However, neither of them had the intention to leave immediately. It was a rare opportunity to have afternoon tea with the Sage of Beasts. Winnie and Panduola also wanted to study the mock duel and the card illustration handbook. Both parties did not want to lose because of their own reasons. If they did not want to lose, they naturally had to spend time studying. However, while they were studying, they were also talking. After Claire was done, she also took out a book and chatted while reading. This ability to split one's attention was passed down from generation to generation. Dake saw the opportunity and quietly returned to the office to take his backpack and the Dragon Fong sword. Then he placed the Dragon Fong sword on the table and asked eagerly, "Senior, take a look at this sword. What do you think of the material?" Panduola looked up and casually said, "It's a sword made from the fangs of a fanged boar dragon. It's passable." "Fanged boar dragon?" Dake's tone faltered. He suddenly felt that the sword in his hand did not smell good. Although a fanged boar dragon was also a dragon, it was the dragon that looked the least like a dragon among the dragon subspecies. Other than their large size, dragon scales, and a sharp horn on their head, they were completely in the shape of a wild boar. The Dragon Fong sword in Dake's hand was made from the fangs of a fanged boar dragon. Moreover, the fangs of a fanged boar dragon were a renewable resource. Under normal circumstances, a fanged boar dragon would change its fangs every year. When the demons were at their peak, there were high-ranking vampires who reared fanged boar dragons to harvest their dragon fangs. Because of that, the price of dragon fangs on the market plummeted for a long time. "You got this Dragon Fong sword from the underground city, right?" Winnie suddenly asked. Dake sighed and said, "Yes, I got it from a treasure chest." Winnie said, "The underground city can always replicate all kinds of things. Just like the Dragon Fong sword in your hand. It's obviously made from dragon fangs, but the craftsmanship is extremely poor. Other than the blade, the rest of it looks like it's simply nailed on. However, that's good. It's easy to disassemble it. I suggest you take out the dragon fangs and grind them into powder, and throw away the rest of the shell." "That's what I was thinking." Dake's eyes lit up. The two of them had the same idea. Dake struck while the iron was hot. He took out a horn that looked like the dragon Fong's sword, but it was made of good material. This rhinoceros horn was thick and long. Its value was even higher than Dake's cat grass. He asked, "What about this horn? Can the material be used?" Winnie looked at it carefully and said, "If I'm not wrong, this should be the horn of a roaring rhinoceros." The horn of a roaring rhinoceros is hollow. It can store echoes and release them instantly to deafen people. I suggest you refine it into an item card. You should be able to get an item card with the roaring sure kill skill. Dake listened carefully and thought, so it's a roaring rhinoceros? Then it shouldn't be very compatible with a single-horned rhinoceros. I thought I had a chance to refine one. Maybe refining it into an item card is a good choice. He suddenly said, "Wait." Then he ran into the office, took out his little notebook, and recorded down the rhinoceros horn's usage suggestions. Winnie looked at his goal of harvesting all the wool, and couldn't help but lift the notebook and chuckle. But what Dake took out next made her frown. She pursed her lips and said, "Biological orb?" "Yes, biological orb." Dake carefully took out the biological orb from a box and placed it on the table. The biological orb was about the size of a fist. It was crystal clear, and there was a very small thing that looked like a biological embryo hidden in the middle. Winnie probably didn't expect him to take out such a rare item. She said with a surprised tone, "Did you get this from the dungeon? Didn't you second-year students enter the dungeon for the first time?" "I was lucky and found a few treasure chests." Dake looked at Panduola and asked, "Can you tell what kind of creature this biological orb contains?" Winnie said excitedly, "Let me see." She extended her hand and held the biological orb in front of her. Her eyes lit up as she observed it. On the other side, other than Eve and Erin who didn't know much about it, Claire and Panduola also noticed it. Claire put down the biological orb and said with a smile, "You're really lucky. When I was in the college, I rarely obtained biological orbs from the dungeon. If it's information about an extinct creature, it's even more valuable." She turned to Winnie and asked, "How is it? Do you see anything?" Winnie's eyes narrowed and said hesitantly, "It looks like a reptile. I'm not sure. If you want to identify it further, you'll need professional equipment to map out the creature's information." "Let me do it," Panduola said calmly and extended his hand to grab the biological orb in Winnie's hand. But Winnie knitted her brows and didn't have the intention to let go. Panduola knitted her brows. Mana flowed out from her fingertips and surrounded the biological orb. Then, she exerted a little force and snatched it from Winnie's hand. She didn't care about Winnie's reaction and placed the biological orb in front of her. Then, she widened her eyes and a trace of golden red flashed across them. "Draconic aura?" Winnie turned her head abruptly and stared at Panduola's excessively fair face. Black hair and black eyes. Apart from a tiny dragon scale that looked more like an ornamental mole at the bottom of her eye, Panduola's appearance didn't have any characteristics related to dragons. Even though she had the title of Silver Dragoness, it was only a compliment to the deck she was used to using. Panduola had been hiding her mixed blood until now. But ever since she met Hephaestus, she didn't pay attention to it anymore. As the draconic aura flowed out, a dazzling golden red color gradually emerged in her eyes. She looked at the biological orb more attentively. "True dragon's eye?" Dake looked at it attentively, but his gaze was all on Panduola's eyes and not the biological orb. Claire wasn't surprised at all and was still relaxed. Under the gaze of True Dragon's Eye, the biological orb slowly changed. A layer of shadow suddenly appeared outside the substance that looked like a biological embryo. The layer of shadow slowly expanded under the golden red light and gradually exceeded the size of the biological orb. A clear outline appeared. When Panduola stopped gazing, it already had the appearance of a living creature. Panduola placed the biological orb on the table, and the clear and distinct shadow of a living creature even started to walk on the spot with its four limbs. Looking at Dake's surprised expression, Panduola raised her eyebrows and said, "If you have such questions in the future, just look for me directly." Is this the beauty of being a student? Claire's gaze inadvertently turned to the faces of the three people, but the melancholy of memories appeared in her heart. Dake came back to his senses and quickly focused on the biological orb. The shadow on the orb looked like a reptile, like an ancient dinosaur, but it had a pair of bat wings on its back. From the top of its head to its tail, there were gem-like tissues along its spine. However, since the shadow didn't have any color, it was impossible to identify the color of these gemstones. From the looks of it, the information recorded in the biological orb should belong to a pterodactyl. Is it a type of flying dragon? However, Winnie Scotty spoke up. Panduola didn't object. It should be. Maybe it's a type of gem dragon. Gem dragon was a type of dragon that didn't have horns on its head but had flat and round gemstones. Their love for gemstones was different from other dragon species. They didn't collect them for collection but for food. Gem dragon fed on gemstones and other minerals, and it could absorb magic from the minerals to become harder and stronger. The few of them gathered together and explained the characteristics of this ancient flying dragon in a few words. Dake listened carefully with a learning attitude for a long time, but in the end, he only came up with 4 words: fossil pterodactyl, rock type, flying type, and a dragon subspecies. He immediately thought of the fossil pterodactyl. Although the fossil pterodactyl didn't have any gemstones on its back, its overall shape was very similar. If he could extract the information from the biological orb, he might be able to refine a similar magic guide fairy. Coincidentally, he still had the dragon tooth sword. Although it was the tooth of a fanged boar dragon, it was still a dragon, wasn't it? However, this bit of dragon tooth could only be used as an auxiliary material. If he wanted to use the information in the biological orb to reconstruct an ancient flying dragon, he would need a lot of knowledge and resources. He needed to learn more knowledge, especially the method to refine a magic guide fairy. Only by mastering this knowledge could he develop the formula to refine a magic guide. After Dake finished taking notes, Panduola returned the biological orb to him. He carefully put the biological orb into a box as if he was protecting a fossil pterodactyl egg. Panduola said in a calm tone, "Is there anything else you want to ask?" Dake quickly took out a bottle of potion and asked, "What kind of potion is this?" The potion bottle was only as long as a finger, and the liquid inside was clear and transparent. Other than being slightly sticky, it looked like ordinary water. However, Panduola casually glanced at this potion and said, "Holy water of fortune, a type of holy water with weak healing properties." Holy water. Dake's eyes lit up. However, Panduola quickly said, "I heard that a long time ago, the Holy Church distributed this holy water of fortune to the outside world, claiming that it was a gift from God." Dake's face darkened, and he immediately understood what she meant. This holy water of fortune was probably not just a product of healing potion mixed with water. However, he quickly frowned and said, "But this potion's value is not low under the eye of truth's evaluation." "That's because of the bottle," Winnie said casually. "This bottle is a magic tool with special power. It can seal potions for a long time without spoiling." "I see." Dake quickly took notes. This kind of magic tool was often used to seal potions that spoiled quickly. It was very useful whether it was daily life or time. Of course, there were similar tools sold in Traveler's Street, but the price was a little expensive. Dake suddenly thought of something and asked, "Then what is the spiritual substance left behind after a soul flayer's death?" Panduola quickly said, "Soul remnant can be used to create a base for a magic guide fairy card. It has better effects than the base made from fairy honey and brain lobe essence. If you want to refine a 3rd-tier magic guide fairy, you can consider using it to create a life base." Dake nodded and immediately took notes. After that, he took out a blood-red crystal from his bag, wanting to ask what kind of creature's blood crystal this blood crystal belonged to. However, just as he took it out, Panduola said, "The blood crystal of a blood demon. If refined further, it can be used to supplement the blood essence stone that Victoria is wearing." Blood demon was the second evolution process for non-hereditary vampires. After a human received the embrace of a vampire, they would become a blood slave without any rationality. The next step was to evolve into a blood demon, and finally vampires. Even if these blood crystals were not used to create blood essence stones, they could be given to Victoria to eat as snacks. Of course, Dake did not advocate such extravagant and wasteful behavior. However, if it was not eaten as snacks, but used by Victoria as a material for magic refinement, according to the rules, Victoria would have to pay credits or take a loan. However, the Academy's rules in this regard were not strict. There were many ways to take advantage of the loopholes. The most commonly used method was to give it as a gift. It was usually a birthday gift or a holiday gift. Of course, it was fine even if they did not abide by the rules. No professor would be bored enough to pursue such matters. Let's treat it as a Halloween gift. If the sacred sword of blood isn't exchanged before Halloween, we'll put it in the gift box. Dake made the decision and took out a bronze mirror from his bag. There were too many unknown items among the treasures obtained from the dungeon. For example, the bronze mirror did not have any reaction even if mana was injected into it. However, in the eyes of the Door of Truth, it was more valuable than the kitty grass, just like the rhino horn. When he took out the bronze mirror, Claire, Panduola, and Winnie were moved. Dake could not help but sigh at the huge gap between him and them. However, because of the gap, he had the motivation to catch up. He placed the bronze mirror in the middle and asked, "Do you see anything?" But this time, Panduola and Winnie only stared at the mirror and pondered. After a moment, seeing that the two did not react, Claire took the mirror and said, "If I'm not wrong, this should be a replica of the Mirror of Medusa's Gaze." Winnie said, "So it's a replica? No wonder it doesn't have the aura that matches the legends." Panduola said, "I can see it, but I don't know how to activate it." "It's not difficult." Claire stretched out her finger and pressed it on the mirror. This bronze mirror, which was obtained from the between bronze treasure chest, had a round bronze frame. The edges of the frame were engraved with beautiful and complicated patterns. The rust on the surface was the remnants of time. Claire gathered mana on her fingertips and wrote a line of spells on the mirror very smoothly. After the last stroke, she withdrew her hand. The mirror was already suffused with a gray light. Then she picked up a teacup from the side and slowly approached the mirror. When the teacup touched the light, the side of the teacup was covered with a layer of stone. She moved her finger and pushed the teacup against the mirror. The teacup was completely petrified in the blink of an eye. However, when the magic of the bronze mirror was exhausted and the gray light disappeared, the petrified shell of the teacup fell off and disappeared. Claire said, "Apart from the fact that it has to be illuminated continuously and that the petrification effect is different, it's no different from the real thing. That's already the difference between heaven and earth, okay?" Dake complained in his heart, but there was excitement in his eyes. If he could craft this bronze mirror into an item card, he would have the first magic card with powerful control. He did not stop. Then, he immediately took out the silver sphinx that he also obtained in between bronze, and asked, "What about this?" What kind of surprise would the silver sphinx, which was close to the biological pearl, and the dragon-tooth sword in value, bring him? This sphinx was the size of a square paperweight. It was delicately carved and looked very lifelike. The three of them could not help but move closer to take a look. Winnie muttered, "Sphinx? I seem to remember that this is the pet of a certain god of death. The god of burial rites and knowledge, Husks." Panduola said, "I've seen his records, but the Sphinx is not his pet. He himself is a Sphinx." "Is that so?" Winnie touched her nose awkwardly. Claire smiled and said, "Husks is the earliest Sphinx. Since then, all the Sphinxes have the suffix of beast to distinguish them. In the records in the library, he is both the god of death and the god of wisdom. He is also the founder of a civilization. However, this silver statue does not have any divinity, so it has little to do with Husks. As for what is special about it, I can't see it for now. What about you?" Faced with the Sage of Beasts' question, although Winnie and Panduola wanted to show it, they both shook their heads after checking it carefully. Claire asked, "Panduola, you can't see it either?" Panduola said helplessly, "It looks like a very ordinary silver statue. Other than the excellent workmanship, there is nothing special about it." Suddenly, a trace of cold air appeared beside her. It was Winnie who opened the Eye of Truth. After a long while, Winnie closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they were full of doubts. Why is a silver statue so valuable? Could it be that the God of Truth loves the Sphinx? I don't think so. Claire picked up the Sphinx and looked at it for a while. Finally, she threw it back to little Dake, who was looking at it eagerly. She smiled and said, "But it seems that this thing has to be studied by you." Dake opened his mouth and could only put the Sphinx away. He felt that Claire must have a way to find out, but she just did not want to. However, this afternoon, they were not here to appraise treasures. They did not have professional equipment in their hands. If they only relied on their knowledge and vision, there was a limit. Although Dake was inevitably disappointed, he quickly calmed himself down and took out the next treasure from his bag. "You obtained all these last weekend when you went to the dungeon for an adventure?" Seeing that Dake had endless treasures, Winnie finally couldn't help but ask. "It was just luck." Dake placed a wood carving in the middle of the table. This wood carving was found in a hidden room near the treasure chest that contained the creature pearl. The treasure chest that contained the wood carving was 2 meters tall and 3 meters wide. It could be said that it was the largest treasure chest that he had ever opened. However, the wood carving was only 20 centimeters tall. It was a sculpture of a human sitting cross-legged. The details were not detailed and were far from the Sphinx. Its value was only between the wormwood and the cat grass. It was on the same level as the bottle that contained the blessing water, the blood crystal, and the soul remnant of the soul-sucker. After Panduola and Winnie examined it for a while, they confirmed its use. This was the original embryo of a substitute puppet. It could be used to make a magic item, substitute puppet. Seeing that Dake was slightly puzzled, Panduola patiently explained, "Substitute puppet is a special item used for escape. It can take damage for the owner at a critical moment and automatically trigger the flash incantation at that moment to teleport the owner to a nearby location. However, substitute puppet is a one-time item. Hence, as enchanters, we are more willing to make it into an item card." She then took out a substitute puppet card from her card bag and waved it in front of Dark. "I also have a substitute puppet card here, but after using it once, the cooldown period is very long. If you want to learn how to make it, you can look for me." "Okay." Dake put the wood carving into his bag as if it was a treasure. Although the wood carving was just an embryo, if it could be successfully made, it would undoubtedly be a life-saving treasure. Moreover, it would be a godly item in a magic item duel. It could help the main force of the magic item dodge a fatal blow. In his joy, Dake took out a clown mask from his bag. When Winnie saw the clown mask, she couldn't help but facepalm. "Junior Dimming, I want to know where you found so many strange items?" "Treasure chests from the dungeon," Dake said matter-of-factly. Panduola shrugged slightly. The news that there was a treasure chest maniac among the second-year students had already spread quietly. However, Winnie Scarty was indeed oblivious to the outside world and knew nothing about it. Fortunately, she was mentally prepared from the beginning. Otherwise, she would have been shocked. After all, even if she could easily find a boss, after killing a boss, she would only be able to find 1 or 2 treasure chests. She wouldn't be like Dake Dimming, who carried a sack and entered the dungeon. As she thought about it, the clown mask was in Winnie's hand. Winnie opened her Eye of Truth and carefully looked at it. Then, she injected a bit of magic into the clown mask and put it on her face without any hesitation. The clown mask suddenly wriggled and tightly stuck to her face. Then, she could clearly feel the corner of her mouth being pulled open. Although she didn't want to, she was forced to let out a funny laugh. She blushed and hurriedly took off the clown mask. Panduola took it and teased, Your laughter is not bad. Winnie closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She regained her smile and said, "This clown mask can make people laugh, but it can't make people laugh from the bottom of their hearts. So far, it doesn't seem to have any real effect. It's not even as good as a happy card." Panduola looked at it carefully and compared it to her face. In the end, she didn't dare to put it on. She put down the mask and looked into Dake's eyes and said, "Our dear junior is an expert in the study of emotions. I think he can definitely modify it into a suitable item card. I'll try my best." Dake put away the clown mask. The first thing he thought of when he got the clown mask was the Clown Emperor in Digimon. However, the Clown Emperor was an ultimate Digimon. If it was transformed into a magical elf, it would at least be at the 4th tier. With the quality of the clown mask, it was impossible for it to be the core material of the Clown Emperor. Therefore, he had to think of other ways to use it. Senior Sister Pandora's suggestion was very good. If he could combine bliss and improve it, he could make it into a mask that could make people feel ecstatic from the inside out, so much so that they couldn't control their laughter. Then, he could refine a special control type item card. Looks like I have to learn how to make item cards faster. After Dake put the clown mask back into his bag, he took out the final treasure, the blood crystal crown. It's still 10,000 words, 5 chapters. Begging for votes. A 231 of 233. Because it's too lousy, it's still missing 2 chapters. Chapter 596. This blood crystal crown was worn by the Blood Frog King when it appeared. However, the Blood Frog King was huge and fat, while the blood crystal crown was very small. Even if it was worn on a child's head, it wouldn't be uncomfortable. It was as if it was carved out of blood coral. It was crystal clear, and if one looked closely, one could see that there was a red light flowing within it, emitting a very rich magic power. Dake placed the blood crystal crown on the table and gently placed it down. Although the level of the Blood Frog King was only 6 stars, the value of the blood crystal crown in the Eye of Truth was even higher than the trash slime. It was similar to the Magic Fire magic book. The clown mask, biological pearl, silver sphinx, and dragon tooth sword from before couldn't compare to it. "Can you help me take a look at this?" Dake's tone was filled with hope. "What a beautiful crown. Did you get this from the treasure chest in the dungeon?" Winnie asked. "Not really." Dake said, "It was dropped by an elite monster when we were fighting a boss." Winnie asked curiously, "What kind of monster is it?" "It's actually wearing a crown." Dake said, "A Blood Frog King." "Blood Frog King?" Winnie's slender fingers that were reaching for the blood crystal crown suddenly stopped. Panduola didn't have any scruples. She took the blood crystal crown in front of her and examined it carefully. After a while, she asked, "Since it's the crown of the Blood Frog King, it should be able to increase the control of blood elements. Did you see the Blood Frog King use the power of the crown?" Dake shook his head slightly and said, "In fact, the Blood Frog King only released an aura skill that increased all of its members at the beginning." Panduola asked, "And then?" Dake said, "It died." "That's troublesome." Panduola tapped her fingers on the table lightly and said, "I don't have the talent for blood magic. Even if I inject magic power, I can't activate it." Maybe you can summon that leopard girl and let it try?" "It's not a leopard girl, it's a cat girl," Dake defended the Basti beast. "If it really doesn't work, this is probably the only way." Even though there were many people in the academy with talent for blood magic, he would not give up what was close at hand for what was far away. However, Winnie frowned and said, "If I remember correctly, the Blood Frog race has a very strange ritual. Their king is chosen from tens of thousands of people, and then they will be worshipped and crowned king. The crown was the proof of a king, and also the source of power. The Blood Frog King received the gift of the crown to obtain the power of a king." "The proof of a king?" Dark's heart skipped a beat as he suddenly thought of the item called King's Certificate. In the works of Pokemon, the King's Certificate, which was also in the shape of a crown, was a very important item. Not only could it give Pokemon's moves an abnormal status of making people cower, but it could also make Mosquito Incense Frog, Fast Swimming Frog, and Dazed Beast evolve into Mosquito Incense Frog Emperor, Bullfrog Monarch, and Dazed King. Dake would definitely not forget about an item that had the same effect as the Evolution Stone. Senior Winnie's description of the Blood Crystal Crown was inexplicably compatible with the King's Certificate. Moreover, Mosquito Incense Frog Emperor and Dazed King were mainly of the water element, which matched the attributes of the Blood Frog. Thinking of this, Dake could not help but think, maybe, combined with the Great Sin card, I can refine this Blood Crystal Crown into a special King's Certificate? However, he immediately shook his head. The idea was good, but unfortunately, reality was cruel. It was not that he could not refine it successfully. After all, no one knew without trying. However, he did not have Mosquito Incense Frog or Dazed Beast. Even if he refined the King's Certificate, it would not be of much use. Moreover, the water element was the main attribute of jealousy. Unless this King's Certificate could be refined with pride, and the refined King's Certificate would be effective on magic spirits other than Mosquito Incense Frog and Dazed Beast. Although the possibility is very low, I can think in this direction for the time being. Other than this, there is another way. Since this Blood Crystal Crown and Blood Frog are so closely related, perhaps I can use this as the core to refine Mosquito Incense Frog Emperor, or Dazed King, or Monster Frog Emperor. Dake thought for a moment and looked up at Claire. However, Claire did not say much this time and only watched them do their work. Dake sighed slightly and put away the Blood Crystal Crown. Although this treasure was very valuable, it did not seem to be easy to use. After he put the Blood Crystal Crown away, he thought for a moment and took out a long box. This box was found by little Ivan in the final room of the boss, and there was a scroll made of animal skin hidden inside. He opened the box under the curious gazes of the people around him and took out the scroll inside. Then, he spread it out on the table. I found this scroll in the boss room of the 10th floor. It looks like a map of a certain place. Map. Because Dake deliberately spread the scroll out, Winnie and Panduola could see it very clearly. The two of them noticed the hexagram symbol on the upper right corner of the scroll almost at the same time, and they had the same thought as Dake. Could this be a treasure map? Winnie muttered. A treasure map obtained from the dungeon. Panduola looked up at Dake and asked, other than this scroll, what else did you find in the boss room? Dake thought for a moment and said, the key to the 15th floor of the dungeon. Looks like it. Panduola smiled. This should be the map of the 15th floor of the dungeon. Dake immediately understood. Looks like Senior Sister has experienced something similar? Panduola nodded. Something like that. When you enter the 15th floor, take this treasure map and walk to the nearest location. It will lead you to the entrance of the hidden space. After that, it will be a treasure hunt. I've obtained a similar treasure map from a deeper floor before. Of course, the reward and the danger are usually proportional. Under normal circumstances, the hidden space of the dungeon was more dangerous than the original level. So, if you want to hunt for treasure, you have to be prepared. I will. Dake nodded. Hidden spaces were hard to come by. Although he had found many hidden rooms, he had only entered the hidden space once. That time, it was the AI Ma that triggered the mechanism. If this treasure map could lead him to the hidden space of the 15th floor, it would be great. However, he probably would not have time to enter the dungeon again in the near future. This treasure map was temporarily sealed. After rolling up the treasure map and putting it back into the box, Dake thanked the two senior sisters and returned to the office, with his backpack and Dragon Fong sword. This afternoon's mission was successfully completed. Although there were still some questions left, it was much better than before when he couldn't figure out what was going on. If it were not for his lack of skills, he would have gone to the laboratory to make all kinds of item cards. But now, Dake left the office and walked into Deanna's candy house, naturally. When he came out of the candy house, he had already brought out a plate full of pastries and candies. Then, it was afternoon tea time. When afternoon tea was over, it was almost 4 o'clock. Panduola and Winnie both took the card illustration handbook. They were obviously interested in this exhibition match. Claire and the twin sisters also left quickly. The Magical Animal Society was bustling again. The magic elves pattered out, and the members of the club who had been hiding in their rooms all this time also came out to take a breather. The Sage of Beasts and the two senior sisters were still very oppressive. Now that they had left, the society finally returned to normal. When it was mealtime, the 5 members of the society went to the cafeteria to have a small meal. Dake did not return to the society. Instead, he went back to his dorm. He took out the treasures from his backpack and sorted them out. Then, he sat down and flipped through the notes from the afternoon. Then, he started to take action. According to the recommendations, rhino horn, bronze mirror, wood carving, and clown mask were to be made into item cards. Other than wood carving, the other 3 treasures could be made using conventional methods. If he wanted to make wood carving into an item card for wooden puppet, he would have to consult with Panduola. Also, blood crystal was to be given to Victoria as a snack. Silver Sphinx was still to be researched. Biological pearl was to be made into a magic elven card. However, he had not mastered the technique of extracting genetic information, and he had not mastered the technique of directional crafting, so he had to put it aside for the time being. As for the blood crystal crown, he had not figured out how to use it yet. What he could do now was to pour out the blessing water and empty the bottle. Then, he would take out the dragon tooth sword and grind it into powder to preserve it. Finally, he would further process and preserve the soul remnant of the soul flayer in preparation for the 3rd-tier magic elven card. The things that could be done were not difficult, but they were very tedious and time-consuming. Dake could not always push all these things to meow meow. He also needed to learn from them. The blade of the dragon tooth sword was ground into a large jar of dragon tooth powder. The soul remnant was also made into a jelly-like life foundation. However, when these 2 things were done, it was already late at night. Dake washed up and went to bed. After practicing Underworld Spirit spell, he went to sleep. Thursday morning, alchemy class. Professor Zayer was not in a hurry to continue teaching. Instead, he spent the entire class teaching the students how to familiarize and consolidate the usage of Eye of Truth. It was also during this class that Dake became more aware of the advantages and disadvantages of his Eye of Truth. His Eye of Truth might be able to see more and deeper, but in some areas, it was still inferior to some Eye of Truth that had special characteristics. For example, Winnie's Eye of Truth had a natural advantage when it came to measuring ice attribute items. Tom Nixon's Eye of Truth was faster and more accurate when it came to measuring things related to the blood element. As the saying went, there were specializations in skills. After the alchemy class ended, Dake went straight to the library. Under the recommendation of Senior Panduola, he borrowed a book related to the creation of item cards. The second-year Introduction to Magic textbook also talked about the conventional method of creating item cards. However, the length of the textbook was limited, and Professor Zayer had not taught him this part yet. If he wanted to study independently, it was best to find a more specialized book. For example, the book in Dake's hand, 3,000 items, 8,000 training methods. If it wasn't for Senior Panduola's strong recommendation, Dake would not have wanted to borrow this book that was thicker than a brick. He always felt that after he finished reading this book, the semester would be over. However, it didn't take long for him to really enjoy it. Good heavens, someone actually compiled so many methods to refine tools. There were generally 2 ways to create item cards. One was to use magic to refine ready-made items into item cards. The other was to use raw materials to directly refine them, just like weapon forging. 3,000 items, 8,000 training methods. Only had 2 chapters. The first chapter talked about the ideas of these 2 conventional training methods. Among them, the first was the main content, and the second was just a brief introduction. As for the second chapter, it completely separated the various types of items in detail. Then, each type corresponded to a training method, and all of them were methods to refine existing items. Just the table of contents alone had hundreds of pages. After Dake roughly looked through it, he felt that the 8,000 training methods was not empty talk. It was really terrifying. However, with this book, as long as one had enough patience, they could basically find the item card refining method that could be used as a reference. Dake shifted his focus to learning how to refine item cards, and quickly became obsessed. It was to the extent that he had to take out the great absent-minded method that he had not used for a long time, so that he would not be blinded by greed. It's a pity that I didn't bring the 2-headed demon's bloodthirsty axe back to the academy. Otherwise, I could experiment and verify it according to the book. Even if that thing is broken, I won't feel bad. Dake could not help but sigh. At night, after the astrology class ended, Dake brought the magic elves back to the dormitory and began the first official refining of item cards. He did not completely grasp the refining technique of item cards, but he wanted to verify what he had learned through experiments. Of course, under such circumstances, it was impossible to use those high-value materials for experiments. Dake picked in front of the material cabinet. Finally, between the Ring of Strength and the Pearl of Perception, he chose the Pearl of Perception. The value of these 2 items obtained from the dungeon was not as high as the wormwood, and they belonged to the lowest grade of treasure chest treasures. However, the Ring of Strength only required a little mana to increase the arm strength, and it was very suitable for daily use. It could also help Dake slightly reduce the power gap between him and those who were born with superhuman strength. Although the Pearl of Perception could increase one's perception and help adventurers discover traps more easily, as the enhancement was not large, the actual use was not that great. Moreover, as long as it was successful, it would only change from an item to an item card. If it failed, it would not be a heartache. As it was very late, Dake quickly prepared and immediately began the experiment. He was not completely inexperienced. After finding the conventional refining method of similar items from the 3,000 items, 8,000 training methods, the initial experiment could be said to be quite smooth. The conventional method of refining an item into an item card was actually just a few steps. The first thing to do was to process the item that needed to be refined. Normally, the item would be soaked in the corresponding magic potion to try as much as possible to soften the item so that it would be easier to refine it. The softening here was of course not the conventional meaning of softening. It referred to the lowering of the item's authenticity from 100% to 999,999%, even if it was only 0.00001%, it would be considered as destroying the item's authenticity. Only by crossing this boundary would there be the possibility of refining the item into an item card. Therefore, the magic potion used was called the Temporary Reality Reversal Illusory Potion. But the magicians were more used to calling it the Softening Potion. As the name implied, the Softening Potion was only temporary, and the magicians had to complete the refining of the item card within the time limit. The difficulty of refining would increase according to the duration of the Softening Potion. And because the corresponding Softening Potion for each item was different, the magicians had to be able to mix it on their own. Therefore, the refining threshold of the item card was not low. Without the 3,000 items, 8,000 training methods, Dake would need at least a week or 2 just to research and mix the Softening Potion of the Perceptive Orb. Fortunately, his luck was not bad. After the Perceptive Orb was soaked in the Softening Potion for about 5 minutes, there was a strange illusory feeling on the surface. Clearly, the orb did not have the slightest change with the naked eye, but it felt a little blurry. The feeling of being in between reality and illusion was very strange. After looking at it for a long time, it would make one's scalp numb. Dake quickly withdrew his gaze and began the next step. The second step of refining the item card was to adjust the surface of the blank magic card and make it compatible with the item that needed to be refined. This required the mixing of the pigment, which was the axis that was poured into the magic pen. Then, the pigment was used to write the corresponding magic language on the blank magic card and change it. Although the magic language used here was not as strict as the requirements for refining the magic spell card, it still needed to be compiled according to the corresponding item or copied from a similar template. Of course, Dake copied a chapter from the 3,000 items, 8,000 training methods. After completing this step, the preparation work for refining the item card was considered done. After that, it would enter the normal process of making the magic card. That was to add various materials and potions one by one, carve the refining array, stack it up slowly, and finally draw and activate the number 4 refining array. The so-called number 4 refining array was the core refining array of the item card. It was called the Heimer refining array. Heimer was the great magician who created the next great era after the inventor of the number 3 refining array, Dalton. The Heimer refining array he invented could turn material objects into virtual objects and completely imprint them on the magic card. Then, it would be projected according to the imprint. Because he was the first person in human history to use magical technology to break through the boundary between virtual and reality, he was called the father of virtual and reality in historical records. After half an hour, Dake finally succeeded in drawing and activating the number 4 refining array before the time limit of the perceptive orb softening was up. The last step was to put the perceptive orb and the corresponding auxiliary materials into the light array formed by the number 4 refining array. Under normal circumstances, the magician would add some auxiliary materials to enhance the function of the item. However, Dake did not need this, so he just put in the basic materials step by step. There were not many mistakes in the entire refining process, and the final result was barely satisfactory. In short, what he learned today was indeed verified. The magic card in his hand had a composition that was no different from the perceptive orb. It was just that the little spider bubble that was originally hidden in it had become a shadow attached to the orb. As for its effect, was it weaker than before, or was it stronger? He would have to summon it to test it out. After careful observation, Dake cast the usual summoning spell. In the name of Dake Dimeng, I summon the magic card. As the summoning spell ended, a faint white light appeared on the magic card. The shadow of a transparent spider emerged from the card, holding a white orb in its arms. Card name, Spider Orb. Type, Item Card. Effect, Perceptive Sense +1. Killer Skill, Spider Silk Sense. Spider Silk Sense. The spider orb releases a ray of light like spider silk, sensing and investigating the environment within the range. Spider Sense? So, this orb is called the Spider Orb? Doc held the spider pearl in his hand and pondered for a moment before whispering, Spider Sense. The white orb in the transparent spider's arms suddenly emitted a white light, and the ray of light like spider silk shot out in all directions. With a little control, the ray of light was retracted in one direction, and then penetrated the wall without any hindrance and went out of the wall. Dake only stopped the spider silk sense when the ray of light had drifted to its limit, and the ray of light was sucked back into the orb. I see, this ray of light has the ability to sense and investigate. Once there is an unexpected situation, the spider on the orb will have different reactions. Although it will take time to master it, it is unexpectedly more useful than I thought. The disadvantage is that after refining the magic card, if it wants to last for a long time, it will need to be injected with magic. But this orb needs to be injected with magic to activate it, so there is not much difference. Then, this time's item card refinement should be considered a success, right? Dake stopped the summoning and began to ponder. His main task was to find the missing parts in the book, correct the inadequacies in the experiment, and further study. This step took even more time than the experiment. It wasn't until after midnight that Doc finally fell asleep. The next morning, Dake continued to read 3,000 items, 8,000 training methods. Then, at 9:30 a.m., he started on the pink crescent pendant. This crescent pendant was the first treasure he obtained after entering the underground city. Although there was not much magic inside, its value in the eye of truth exceeded the wormwood. Dake's wormwood was frequently used to store great sins, so its value in the eye of truth was actually higher than the ordinary wormwood. From this, it could be seen that the crescent moon pendant must have something special about it. It could be a pink metal chain, or it could be a crescent-shaped pendant. But no matter what it was, it did not prevent him from refining it into an item card. After finding a similar type of item refinement method, Dake began to experiment. The second time, the item refinement was indeed smoother. Although there were a few mistakes along the way, it was not irreversible. He made on-the-spot adjustments and finally pushed to the final step. But this time, when he put the crescent pendant into the number 4 refining array, he also dripped a little bliss at the same time. Without a doubt, bliss and the crescent pendant had a very high compatibility. After cleaning the contaminated magic card, Dake wiped the surface of the card dry and frowned as he carefully examined it. Compared to the spider pearl last night, he had more expectations for the crescent pendant. There was indeed a pink crescent pendant printed on the surface of the card, but the chain had more cloud patterns, and the crescent pendant was also emitting clear moonlight. On the background of the card, there was a half-covered full moon. Dake realized that his experiment was likely to succeed. That drop of bliss was very likely to have triggered the hidden value of the crescent pendant. Don't waste it. In the name of Dake Dim-ing, I summon the magic card. Dense mist appeared on the card surface, and the moonlight parted the clouds, illuminating the face. A pendant that was not much different from the item itself appeared. Card name, Crescent Pendant. Type, Item Card. Effect, Charm +2, Killer Skill, Beauty Under the Moonlight. Beauty Under the Moonlight sometimes mesmerizes the opposite sex that comes in contact with you. Success rate increases when using charm abilities. Under the moonlight, the effect of Crescent Pendant is doubled. Let's not talk about the 2 points of charm for now. Can Beauty Under the Moonlight be stacked with Mesmerizing Body? Dake immediately thought of Mesmerizing Body, a killer skill. Mesmerizing Body and Beauty Under the Moonlight were both killer skills of the charm type. Moreover, Mesmerizing Body had the same effect of mesmerizing the opposite sex that came in contact with you. Dake's Fairy Ibu had Mesmerizing Body as a killer skill. Moon Goddess, in the form of a divinity armament, also had Mesmerizing Body when she released Moon Palace. The item card, Crescent Pendant, was equivalent to giving the wearer an enhanced version of Mesmerizing Body. Not only could it mesmerize the opposite sex, but it could also increase the success rate of the charm type skills. Especially under the moonlight, the effect would be doubled. This meant that Fairy Ibu's Mesmerizing Body and Mesmerizing Voice's mesmerizing effects would increase. Under the moonlight, her charm would be limitless, and no one of the opposite sex would be able to resist her charm. Thus, a formula was born: Frowny Face Fairy Ibu plus Crescent Pendant equals Male Killer. So, where's Fairy Ibu? Dake turned around and saw the little pink cutie staring at the crescent pendant in his hand with its large, light blue eyes. As the embodiment of bliss, this kind of jewelry that was rich in bliss had a natural attraction to it. Moreover, Fairy Ibu had the personality of a little girl and liked cute accessories and little dresses. Dake suddenly had an idea. I wonder if it can learn normal summoning skills now? If I give it this crescent pendant, it'll definitely do its best to learn it, right? Thinking that he might have the chance to create a Fairy Ibu that would study day and night, Dake felt a little excited. If even Fairy Ibu, who had become lazy after school started, could become a model for studying hard. Just as he was thinking, Dake suddenly noticed another gaze looking in his direction. Among the embodiments of bliss, Ball Sea Lion didn't have much bliss factor, Dream Demon and Milk Jar didn't have much interest in jewelry and pretty clothes, and Vampire's Daughter wasn't here. Thus, the only one left was Fox Demon. Dake looked in the direction of the gaze, but the Fox Demon had already turned its gaze away, as if nothing had happened, and was seriously practicing its handwriting, it seemed to care a lot about its claw writing. However, the fox demon didn't have any mesmerizing skills, and this crescent pendant wasn't very compatible with it. Thus, Dake still waved his hand at Fairy Ibu. Me heart suit, Fairy Ibu's eyes lit up, and it hurriedly walked over with small steps, looking very shy. Dake stretched out his hand and put its 2 little claws on his knees, then gently stroked the fur on its back and said, "I'll put it on for you." Fairy Ibu couldn't help but narrow its eyes. Dake used his 2 hands to open the chain of the crescent pendant, and put it on its head, then pulled its 2 long ears to his side. There was actually a buckle on the chain of the pendant, but Dake didn't open it. After putting it on, he picked up Fairy Ibu and looked at it carefully for a while, then smiled and said, "It's very compatible." Whether it was the color of the crescent pendant, or its slightly charming aura, it was very similar to it. The entire pendant seemed to be one with it, a perfect match. Me hot suit hot suit hot suit. Fairy Ibu clearly liked it very much, and its face was full of happiness and excitement. Dake waited until its excitement was over, then said, "Try out the additional ability of this pendant." Fairy Ibu nodded slightly, and activated the item's sure kill ability, the Beauty Under the Moon. Its charming temperament and flesh had clearly increased. Even though Dake had a considerable degree of immunity to that, he still felt a little enchanted in that instant. But from a certain point of analysis, the Beauty Under the Moon and the mesmerizing body didn't have a substantial effect on the opposite sex. What increased its charm should be the success rate increases when using charm-type abilities. If it were under the moonlight, perhaps I really would have been enchanted by you. Dake rubbed hard against Fairy Ibu's face, then put it down. Then he raised the magic card a little, and dispelled the crescent pendant as summon. Me. Fairy Ibu rushed to grab at its neck, but the pendant had already turned into light and disappeared. Dake stroked its head, saying, "When you master the normal summoning spells, this crescent pendant will be yours." Fairy Ibu's eyes lit up, and it nodded excitedly. Then it took the opportunity to be lovey-dovey for a while, before trotting back to read. "Looks like I'll have to prepare some summoning cards for teaching." Dake looked at its back, and couldn't help but ponder. After the crescent pendant, Dake's next target was the Gale Dagger. The value of the Gale Dagger was about the same as the crescent pendant, but the Gale Dagger could shoot out gale blades, and could be considered a very practical weapon. If not for the fact that the first chapter of Magic Fire taught people how to compress magical fire into swords, spears, swords, and halberds, he would most likely have kept the Gale Dagger as a personal weapon. Now, it would be better to refine it into a weapon card. Dake struck while the iron was hot, and began to refine it. In the end, a weapon card was also a type of item card. The conventional refining method could be found in the 3,000 items, 8,000 training methods. This time, he didn't add any supplementary materials, and the main purpose was to increase his proficiency. The more complicated the item, the harder it was to refine it. Items like the spider orb, the crescent pendant, and the Gale Dagger had very simple attributes, but there was only one additional skill, and its function was very clear, so it was very easy to refine. The further he went, the more difficult it would be. After Dake summarized the refining experience of the crescent pendant, refining the Gale Dagger became easier. Other than spending some time looking for similar items in the 3,000 items, 8,000 training methods, everything went relatively smoothly, and he successfully completed the refining before the deadline. Card name, Sickle Dagger. Type, Item Card. Effect, Attack plus 200, additional skill, Sickle Weasel Slash. Sickle Weasel Slash condenses the power of the wind and shoots out a curved wind blade in front of you. A weapon card that can increase attack by 200, it's not very high among the weapon cards, but it's still passable. So its ultimate skill is called Sickle Weasel Slash? Speaking of which, the gun armament that I refined during the holidays is about the same level. Dake summoned the Sickle Dagger, and waved it around in his hand, and it was quite handy. Dong dong dong. Just then, there was a knock on the door. Dake opened the door, and Deanna and Luo C were standing there elegantly. "It's time to go, let's eat," Deanna said excitedly. "Give me a moment." Dake invited them into the room, and quickly cleaned up the leftovers from the experiment. After noon, it would be the opening ceremony of the Silver Cup. 233/233. I don't know why, but I feel very tired today, but I still insisted on finishing the minimum update, reward, and extra updates. Finally, I'm going to sleep. Good night. You're tuning in to the Narrate and Escape YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.